Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. Beneath the cold, indifferent cosmos, humanity stood on the brink of a new era. Earth, with its depleted resources and burgeoning population, was no longer enough to sustain the aspirations of its inhabitants. The quest for a new home had driven the finest minds of the age to search the stars, to seek out a world that could offer a future. Among these pioneers was Dr. Alan Hayes, a man driven not by the need for adventure but by the hope of survival, a hope rooted in the fertile soil of a distant planet known as Perpetua, a world bathed in the light of three suns. Alan's life had been defined by loss. The passing of his wife and daughter during the Earth's last great famine had left him hollowed, a man whose grief had been turned into a fierce determination to prevent others from suffering the same fate. As an agricultural scientist, he had spent years working to genetically modify crops to survive in Earth's increasingly hostile climate, but the task had proven Sisyphean. No matter how many new strains he developed, the planet's failing ecosystems and relentless climate change outpaced his efforts. It was in this despair that the opportunity to join the Perpetua expedition presented itself, and Alan seized it with both hands. Perpetua, a planet discovered on the far fringes of known space, orbited within a stable tri-star system. This rare alignment provided constant daylight, a feature that intrigued and excited scientists, particularly those like Alan, who saw in it the potential for unprecedented agricultural bounty. Here was a world where photosynthesis could occur without interruption, where crops could potentially grow year-round without the hindrance of nightfall or seasonal change. The implications were staggering, and the opportunity to pioneer a new agricultural system on such a planet was a calling Alan could not ignore. The journey to Perpetua was long and arduous, the crew placed in cryogenic stasis to survive the decades-long voyage across the void. Alan's dreams during that time were haunted by images of fields stretching endlessly under an unyielding sun, the faces of his lost family hovering at the edges of his consciousness like ghosts. When he awoke, it was to a world as alien as any he had imagined, yet also, somehow, familiar. The three suns, arranged in a triangular configuration in the sky, cast overlapping shadows and bathed the landscape in a perpetual twilight that was neither harsh nor dim. The air was breathable, the water pure, and the soil, at first glance, seemed fertile. But first glances were often deceiving, as Alan well knew. The initial team of scientists, engineers, and military personnel who made planetfall were met with challenges both expected and unforeseen. The constant daylight, while ideal for the growth of certain crops, posed a serious challenge to the human circadian rhythm. The team struggled to maintain a sense of time, their bodies rebelling against the lack of night. Some fell into deep depressions, others into mania, their minds frayed by the relentless exposure to light. Alan himself felt the strain, his thoughts drifting to the void left by his family's absence, but he forced himself to focus on the task at hand. There was work to be done, and it was a labor of survival, not just for him, but for all of humanity. The soil on Perpetua, while rich in nutrients, contained trace elements that were toxic to most Earth crops. The plants Alan had brought with him withered and died within days of being planted, their roots unable to draw sustenance from the alien Earth. It was a bitter blow, but not an unexpected one. Alan had prepared for this possibility, bringing with him a vast library of genetic material and the tools to create new strains of crops tailored specifically to Perpetua's unique conditions. He and his team worked tirelessly, experimenting with combinations of Earth genes and those found in native flora, seeking a balance that would allow for the creation of viable food sources. Months passed, and the team's progress was slow but steady. Alan's first breakthrough came in the form of a hardy root vegetable, a hybrid of Earth potatoes and a resilient Perpetuan plant that thrived in the planet's acidic soil. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The crop's success gave the team renewed hope, and soon other hybrids followed, grains, fruits, and vegetables that could withstand the harsh soil conditions while benefiting from the constant sunlight. These plants grew faster and larger than their Earth counterparts, their yields astonishing in both quantity and quality. As the agricultural experiment began to bear fruit, Alan turned his attention to the broader ecosystem of Perpetua. The planet was home to a wide variety of native species, many of which were unlike anything seen on Earth. Some of these creatures posed a threat to the burgeoning colony, their territorial instincts leading to clashes with the human settlers. Others, however, presented opportunities. Alan discovered that several species had formed symbiotic relationships with perpetuan plants, aiding in pollination and soil regeneration. By studying these interactions, he was able to incorporate native organisms into the colony's agricultural systems, creating a balanced and sustainable ecosystem that benefited both the crops and the colony as a whole. Among the most remarkable discoveries was a plant the team dubbed lumen flower. This bioluminescent flora thrived under the planet's constant light and emitted a soft, golden glow that intensified at dusk. Its petals were rich in a compound that, when refined, could be used as a potent energy source far more efficient than anything currently available on Earth. Furthermore, early tests indicated that extracts from the lumen flower had powerful medicinal properties, capable of accelerating healing and boosting the human immune system. Alan knew that this discovery would be a game-changer, not just for the Perpetua colony, but for humanity as a whole. With the success of the lumen flower, the Perpetua colony began to thrive. Word of the planet's riches spread back to Earth, and soon a second wave of colonists arrived, bringing with them new challenges and opportunities. Alan found himself at the center of a rapidly growing community, his expertise in agriculture making him a key figure in the colony's development. But with growth came complications. The influx of new settlers strained the colony's resources and infrastructure, and the challenges of adapting to Perpetua's environment persisted. Alan's role expanded beyond that of a scientist. He became a leader, a reluctant one at first, but necessity forced him to take on responsibilities he had never sought. He worked closely with the colony's administrators to ensure that the agricultural systems could keep pace with the growing population. He also played a key role in the colony's defense, helping to develop strategies for dealing with the planet's more hostile native species and ensuring that the settlers could coexist with the local ecosystem without causing irreversible harm. Despite the progress, Alan could never shake the feeling that something was missing. The lumen flower, for all its potential, was a reminder of what he had lost, a light in the darkness that could never fully illuminate the void left by his family's absence. He often found himself wandering the fields at night, the soft glow of the flowers casting eerie shadows on the ground, his thoughts drifting back to Earth and the life he had once known. Yet, in these moments of solitude, he also found a sense of peace. Here, on this distant world, he had found a purpose, a reason to continue despite the pain. The colony's success was his success, and in that, he found a measure of solace. As the years passed, Perpetua transformed from a fledgling outpost into a thriving hub of human activity. The lumen flower became the colony's most valuable export, its energy and medicinal applications revolutionizing industries on Earth and other colonies. The agricultural systems that Alan had developed were expanded and refined, allowing the colony to not only sustain itself but to become a major food supplier to the growing network of human settlements across the galaxy. The success of Perpetua sparked a new wave of exploration and colonization, with other planets being scouted and developed based on the models pioneered by Alan and his team. Yet, for all its success, Perpetua remained a harsh and unforgiving world. The constant daylight, while a boon to agriculture, continued to take its toll on the settlers. Mental health issues were rampant, with many colonists struggling to adapt to a life without night. The colony's leadership worked tirelessly to address these problems, implementing artificial night cycles and creating darkened living quarters to simulate the rhythms of Earth, but the psychological impact of living under constant light remained a persistent challenge. Alan, too, felt the strain. The years of unrelenting work, coupled with the lingering grief over his lost family, wore on him. He began to retreat from public life, spending more time in his laboratory and the fields he had cultivated. He watched as new generations of colonists took up the mantle of leadership, young men and women who had been born on Perpetua and knew no other world. They looked to him with a mix of reverence and curiosity, seeing in him a relic of a bygone era, a man who had helped shape their world but who no longer seemed to belong to it. In the twilight of his life, Alan found himself increasingly drawn to the lumen fields, vast expanses of the bioluminescent flowers that now covered much of Perpetua's arable land. He would walk among them for hours, the soft light illuminating his path as he reflected on the journey that had brought him here. He thought of the countless lives that had been saved, the futures that had been secured by the work he had done. But he also thought of the cost, of the sacrifices made, the lives lost, and the inexorable march of time that had taken so much from him. It was on one of these walks that Alan finally felt the weight of his years catch up to him. His legs grew heavy, and his breath came in short, labored gasps. He knew, instinctively, as the familiar pain in his chest tightened. The lumen flowers swayed gently in a breeze that he could barely feel, their soft glow a comforting presence in the gathering haze of his vision. Alan tried to steady himself, one hand reaching out to a nearby stalk, but his strength was waning. The vibrant colors of Perpetua, the ever-present light that had both sustained and challenged him, seemed to blur into one another, a whirl of warmth and luminescence. He knew this was the end, and a part of him welcomed it. The years of relentless toil, the burden of leadership, and the quiet but unyielding sorrow that had shadowed his every step, all of it was slipping away. His life had been dedicated to building a future, to ensuring that the people who came after him would thrive in this alien land. Now, as his own future dwindled to a close, he found solace in the knowledge that he had done all he could, but just as the darkness threatened to pull him under, he felt a presence, a gentle hand on his shoulder, a familiar voice calling his name. It was faint at first, like an echo from a dream, but it grew stronger, more insistent. Alan blinked, his vision clearing slightly, and he turned his head to see a figure standing beside him, silhouetted against the glowing field. "Alan, it's time," the voice said, soft and comforting. It was Maria, his daughter. She was as he remembered her, full of life and with that same warm smile that had always brought him peace. But how could this be? She had been gone for so many years, lost to the harsh realities of a dying earth. And yet here she was, as real and vivid as the flowers around them. "Maria." His voice was weak, barely more than a whisper. "Yes, Dad, it's me." She knelt beside him, her touch as warm and real as it had ever been. "You've done so much, more than anyone could have asked of you. But now, you need to rest." "It's okay, I'm here." Alan's mind struggled to comprehend, to reconcile the impossible with the undeniable. Was this death, or some final mercy granted to a man who had given everything for a cause? He wanted to speak, to ask the questions that lingered on the edge of his consciousness, but the effort was too great. Instead, he simply nodded, a weak but contented gesture, and allowed himself to be led. The field around them seemed to glow brighter, the lumen flowers' light intensifying as Maria helped him to his feet. She was strong, impossibly so, and her presence filled him with a warmth he hadn't felt in decades. As they walked together through the glowing sea of flowers, the pain and fatigue that had plagued him for so long began to fade. In its place was a profound sense of peace, of completion. "Is this real?" he asked, his voice stronger now, as if her touch had infused him with new life. "It's as real as it needs to be," Maria replied, her tone gentle yet firm. "You've given everything to Perpetua, to the people here. You've earned this rest. But you also need to know that your work will continue. They'll carry on what you started." Alan smiled, the words a balm to his weary soul. He had always feared that his efforts might be in vain, that the challenges of Perpetua would prove too great for those who came after him. But hearing this from Maria, whether she was a dream, a vision, or something more, reassured him in a way nothing else could. They walked on, the landscape shifting around them in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. The endless daylight softened, giving way to a warm twilight that Alan had never experienced on Perpetua. The light was golden, suffused with the glow of countless lumen flowers, and the sky above them was filled with unfamiliar constellations. It was beautiful, more beautiful than anything he had ever seen. "Where are we going?" Alan asked, the question more out of curiosity than concern. "Somewhere you can be at peace," Maria said. "Somewhere you can rest." Alan nodded again, feeling a deep sense of acceptance. For so long, he had carried the weight of responsibility, the drive to succeed for the sake of others. But now, with Maria by his side, he felt that burden lifting. He had done his part, and it was time to let go. They came to a place where the flowers grew taller, their light casting long shadows that danced in the gentle breeze. Maria stopped, turning to face him, and in her eyes, he saw not just his daughter but a reflection of everything he had fought for, life, hope, and the future. "This is where we say goodbye," she said, her voice tinged with both sadness and joy. "But don't worry. You'll never be alone. What you've built will live on, and so will you, in every seed, every flower, every person who calls Perpetua home." Alan felt tears welling in his eyes, but they were tears of release, not sorrow. He reached out to Maria, his hand trembling, and she took it in hers, her grip as strong and reassuring as it had ever been. "Thank you, Maria," he whispered, the words carrying the weight of a lifetime. She smiled, that same radiant smile that had always filled him with warmth. Then, as gently as she had appeared, she began to fade, her form dissolving into the light until she was one with the field, with the flowers, with Perpetua itself. Alan stood alone, but not lonely, in the twilight of this new world. He looked out over the fields he had nurtured, the land he had helped transform, and felt a deep, abiding peace. The lumen flowers swayed in the breeze, their light a constant, comforting presence. And as the last vestiges of his strength ebbed away, he knew, with absolute certainty, that he had done enough. He lay down among the flowers, the soft earth cradling him as he closed his eyes. The world around him grew quiet, the light dimming to a gentle glow that matched the steady rhythm of his slowing heart. Alan Hayes, the man who had brought life to Perpetua, who had turned a barren world into a thriving home for humanity, took one last breath and let it out in a sigh of contentment. And then, there was only light. As the light enveloped him, there was no pain, no fear, only a sense of floating, as if he were being carried by the very essence of Perpetua itself. Alan's consciousness, no longer tethered to his failing body, seemed to drift into the expanse around him, merging with the glow of the lumen flowers, with the energy that permeated the planet. He felt himself becoming part of something greater, something vast and timeless. It was as if the world was welcoming him, embracing him into its fold. The vibrant life force of Perpetua surged through him, connecting him to every living thing on the planet. He could feel the pulse of the crops he had nurtured, the roots stretching deep into the soil, drawing sustenance from the earth. He sensed the heartbeat of the colony, the people whose lives he had touched and shaped, their hopes and dreams entwined with the land they now called home. But there was more, something deeper, more ancient. As Alan's awareness expanded, he became attuned to the rhythms of Perpetua itself, the primal energies that had shaped the planet long before humanity's arrival. He felt the slow, deliberate rotation of the world, the gravitational pull of its three suns, the ebb and flow of its oceans and rivers. And beneath it all, there was a hum, a low, resonant frequency that seemed to emanate from the very core of the planet. Alan realized that this was the essence of Perpetua, the force that sustained all life on the planet. It was a presence, neither sentient nor indifferent, but simply there, a constant, unfathomable energy that had existed for eons and would continue to exist long after humanity had moved on. In this moment of pure awareness, Alan understood that he had become a part of this cycle, his life and his work now woven into the fabric of the planet. As he floated in this state of connection, time lost all meaning. There was no past, no future, only the eternal now, a continuous flow of existence. The concerns and struggles that had once defined his life seemed distant, almost insignificant in the grand scheme of things. He was at peace, content to simply be, to exist as part of the greater whole. Yet, even in this state of transcendence, a part of Alan remained tethered to his humanity. The memories of his life, of his work on Perpetua, were still there, like faint echoes in the back of his mind. He remembered the faces of the people he had worked with, the challenges they had overcome together, the moments of triumph and despair. He thought of Maria, of the life they had shared on Earth, of the loss that had driven him to this distant world. And he thought of the future, of the generations yet to come who would inherit the world he had helped to build. Gradually, the sensation of floating began to change. The light around him grew warmer, more intense, and he felt a gentle pull, as if he were being drawn back to the surface. The hum of the planet's energy grew louder, more insistent, and he realized that Perpetua was not done with him yet. There was still something he needed to do, some final task that awaited him. Slowly, Alan's consciousness began to coalesce, the formless energy taking shape once more. He felt the familiar sensations of a body returning, a heartbeat, the rise and fall of breath, the solidity of earth beneath his feet. The light around him dimmed, resolving into the soft, golden glow of the lumen fields, and as he opened his eyes, he found himself standing in the very spot where he had lain down. But something was different. The air was charged with a new energy, a sense of anticipation that crackled through the atmosphere. The lumen flowers seemed to shimmer more brightly, their light pulsing in rhythm with the heartbeat of the planet. Alan felt invigorated, his mind clear and sharp, as if he had been reborn. He looked down at his hands, expecting to see the frail, aged limbs of a man who had lived a long life. But instead, his hands were strong and steady, the skin smooth and unblemished. Alan raised one hand to his face, feeling the firm contours of youth, the vitality that had long since faded from his body. He was no longer the old man who had walked into these fields, he was something else, something new. A presence stirred at the edge of his awareness, and Alan turned to see a figure emerging from the light. It was Maria again, but this time, she was not alone. With her were other figures, some familiar, some not, people he had known, people who had been part of his life on Earth and on Perpetua. They surrounded him, their faces calm and serene, their eyes filled with a deep understanding. "Welcome back, Alan," Maria said, her voice resonating with warmth. "You've crossed over, but there's more for you to do." Alan felt a surge of emotion, a mixture of awe and gratitude. He had been given a second chance, a new beginning in a place where time and space no longer held sway. He knew that this was no dream, no hallucination, this was real as anything he had ever experienced. "What is this place?" he asked, his voice steady and clear. Maria smiled, gesturing to the fields around them. "This is Perpetua's heart, the nexus of life on this planet. You've become a part of it, just as we all have. But there's still work to be done, and we need you to help guide those who come after." Alan nodded, understanding dawning on him. He had been chosen, not just for what he had done, but for what he still had to offer. He was no longer bound by the limitations of a mortal body, no longer constrained by the passage of time. He was part of Perpetua now, part of the eternal cycle of life that sustained the planet. Together, Alan and the figures around him began to move through the fields, their steps light and purposeful. As they walked, the landscape shifted and changed, the lumen flowers giving way to other forms of life, vast forests of towering trees, shimmering lakes that reflected the light of the three suns, and mountains that rose majestically into the sky. Alan could feel the presence of the planet in every stone, every leaf, every drop of water. It was alive, vibrant, and full of potential. They reached a clearing, where a group of people stood waiting. These were the next generation of settlers, the ones who would continue the work that Alan and his team had begun. They looked to him with a mixture of awe and respect, their faces lit by the glow of the lumen fields. Alan stepped forward, feeling a deep sense of purpose. He knew what needed to be done, the path that lay ahead. He was no longer alone in this journey, he had the guidance of those who had come before, the support of the planet itself, and the hope of those who would come after. As he began to speak, his voice carried with it the wisdom of a lifetime, the knowledge of a world that had been transformed by his efforts. The settlers listened intently, their eyes bright with determination. They were ready, and so was he. Together, they would continue the journey, building a future on Perpetua that would endure for generations to come. The work was far from over, but Alan knew, with absolute certainty, that they would succeed. And as they set off toward the horizon, the light of the three suns shining down upon them, he felt a profound sense of peace and fulfillment. The future was bright, and it was theirs to create. Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. Jack Watson was always fascinated by the past. As a historian in a world where the present was glorified and the future worshipped, he was one of the few who believed that understanding the past was crucial for shaping a better tomorrow. In this advanced age, where technology had erased most secrets, Jack's work had become more about analyzing data than discovering new truths. That is, until the day he stumbled upon the recording that would change everything, the time echo, a revolutionary device capable of capturing sounds from the past, had become a standard tool in historical research. Through this technology, historians like Jack could listen to the whispers of history, piecing together events with an accuracy that their predecessors could only dream of. Jack had used it countless times, replaying the sounds of ancient markets, forgotten wars, and long-dead political speeches. But this time was different. This time, the echo had captured something that no one was meant to hear. It began as an ordinary day in the archives. Jack was combing through records of a centuries-old conflict known as the Forgotten War. Officially, it had been a minor skirmish, a footnote in history, but something about it had always bothered Jack. The war had erupted suddenly, consumed hundreds of thousands of lives, and then vanished from the collective memory, leaving behind a trail of inconsistencies and half-truths. Jack had never been satisfied with the explanations given in textbooks. As he sifted through the echoes of battlefield orders and soldiers' laments, a new sound caught his attention. It was faint, almost drowned out by the noise of the war, but unmistakably there, a conversation held in secret, away from the chaos of the front lines. Jack isolated the sound, enhancing it until the voices became clear. What he heard made his blood run cold. The conversation was between several high-ranking officials, strategizing not just about the war, but about its true purpose. They spoke of a failed experiment, a biological weapon designed to give their nation an edge in the impending global conflict. But the weapon had backfired, killing thousands of their own citizens instead of the enemy. The war, it turned out, was a cover-up, a way to hide the catastrophic mistake and shift the blame onto their rivals. And the mastermind behind the cover-up? None other than Charles Watson, Jack's own great-grandfather. Jack couldn't believe what he was hearing. His great-grandfather had been revered as a hero, a man who had saved their nation from ruin. To discover that he had not only been involved in such a heinous plot but had orchestrated it was unthinkable. The weight of the truth pressed down on Jack's shoulders, threatening to crush him. He played the recording over and over, hoping to find some mistake, some detail that would exonerate Charles. But there was none. The evidence was irrefutable. For days, Jack wrestled with his conscience. On one hand, he had a duty to history, to truth. On the other, this truth could destroy his family's legacy, and worse, it could destabilize society. The Forgotten War was a cornerstone of their history, taught in schools as a noble sacrifice for the greater good. To reveal the truth now could lead to widespread distrust in the government, in their entire system of values. Jack sought advice from his colleague, Sarah, an ethicist who had always been his sounding board. Over coffee in the quiet of her office, he laid out everything he had discovered. Sarah listened intently, her face a mask of concern. When Jack finished, she sat back in her chair, considering her words carefully. Jack, you have to understand what's at stake here. If you go public with this, it's not just your family that will be affected. This could shake the very foundation of our society. People rely on history to give their lives meaning, to justify the world they live in. If you pull this thread, the whole fabric could unravel. But it's the truth, Sarah. How can I just bury it? I'm not saying you should. But you need to weigh the consequences. Are you prepared to live with what happens next? Once this genie is out of the bottle, there's no putting it back. Jack knew she was right. He had always believed in the power of truth, but he had never faced a truth so dangerous, so capable of tearing apart everything he held dear. That night, he couldn't sleep. The faces of the people who would be affected by his decision haunted him. He saw the students who would lose faith in their education, the families who would question the sacrifices of their ancestors, the leaders who would be branded as villains instead of heroes. And in the center of it all, he saw his great-grandfather, the man he had admired his entire life, revealed as a monster. The next morning, Jack made his decision. He would tell the truth. He couldn't live with himself if he didn't. The world had a right to know, no matter the cost. He spent the next week compiling his research, organizing the evidence, and preparing a report that would leave no room for doubt. When he was ready, he scheduled a public lecture at the National Historical Society, inviting scholars, journalists, and government officials to attend. The day of the lecture, the hall was packed. Jack stood at the podium, looking out at the sea of expectant faces. His hands trembled as he adjusted the microphone, but his voice was steady as he began. He spoke of the forgotten war, of its official narrative, and then, with the weight of history pressing down on him, he revealed the truth. He played the recording, letting the voices of the past echo through the room. There was a collective gasp as the magnitude of the revelation sank in. When Jack finished, the room was silent. No one knew how to respond. The truth was too shocking, too raw. Finally, a voice from the back of the room broke the silence. What happens now? It was a question Jack had asked himself countless times. He didn't have an answer. He could only hope that the truth, once known, would lead to healing, not destruction. But as he left the stage, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had set something in motion that was beyond his control. In the days that followed, the fallout was as severe as Jack had feared. Protests erupted as people demanded answers, accusing the government of lies and cover-ups. History books were pulled from shelves, and schools suspended their lessons on the forgotten war. Jack's family was harassed, their home vandalized by those who felt betrayed by the revelation. But amid the chaos, there were also those who thanked Jack, who saw his actions as a necessary step towards a more honest society. As the dust began to settle, Jack found himself at a crossroads. The National Historical Society had revoked his membership, and his reputation was in tatters. Yet, he felt a strange sense of peace. He had done what he believed was right, even though it had cost him everything. He had faced the truth and had not turned away. One evening, as Jack was packing up his office, he received an unexpected visitor. It was a representative from the government, a woman in a crisp suit who introduced herself as a liaison from a new research initiative. She handed Jack an envelope, her expression unreadable. "We've been watching your work, Mr. Watson. We believe you have a unique perspective that could be valuable for a new project we're undertaking. It involves understanding the implications of historical truth in shaping future policies. We'd like you to be a part of it." Jack opened the envelope and scanned the contents. It was an invitation to join a think tank focused on the ethical implications of time-related technologies. As he read, a sense of purpose began to stir within him. Perhaps this was his next step, a way to continue his work, not just as a historian, but as a guardian of truth. Standing at the threshold of a new chapter in his life, Jack realized that his journey was far from over. The past, with all its complexities and contradictions, had prepared him for this moment. And though the future was uncertain, he knew one thing for sure: he would face it with the same unwavering commitment to the truth that had brought him this far. As he left his office for the last time, Jack looked up at the sky, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. The past had been revealed, and now it was time to look forward, to shape a future where truth, no matter how painful, would never again be buried. Jack stood at the edge of the elevator, the sleek metal doors reflecting the dim lights of the underground facility. The invitation had led him here, to a place that didn't exist on any map, a research center hidden beneath layers of bureaucratic secrecy. As the elevator descended, the hum of machinery grew louder, the air thick with the scent of ozone and something else, something ancient, like dust left undisturbed for centuries. When the doors finally slid open, Jack was greeted by a sterile hallway, its walls lined with screens displaying data streams in languages he didn't recognize. A young woman in a lab coat approached him, her expression professional but distant. "Mr. Watson, welcome to the Temporal Ethics Division," she said, her voice echoing slightly in the narrow corridor. "We've been expecting you. Please follow me." Jack nodded, falling into step beside her as she led him deeper into the labyrinthine complex. The air was cooler here, and the lighting dimmer, casting long shadows that seemed to move on their own. Jack felt a shiver run down his spine, though he couldn't tell if it was from the cold or something else, an unease that had been growing since he accepted the government's offer. They passed several rooms, each one filled with equipment and personnel focused on tasks Jack couldn't begin to understand. There were chambers with what looked like suspended particles, held in place by beams of light, rooms where figures in protective suits manipulated holographic interfaces with precision, and a large auditorium where a group of scientists appeared to be debating heatedly, their voices muffled through the thick glass. Finally, they arrived at a door marked with a simple, "Conference Room A." The woman swiped a card, and the door slid open, revealing a spacious room with a large oval table at its center. Around it sat a group of people, some Jack recognized from his years in academia, others who were unfamiliar, their faces drawn with the weight of their work. Mr. Watson, a tall man at the head of the table, stood, extending his hand. "I'm Dr. Harrison Clark, head of the Temporal Ethics Division. It's an honor to have you here." Jack shook his hand, noting the firm grip and the way Clark's eyes seemed to study him, as if assessing more than just his handshake. "Thank you, Dr. Clark. I'm still not entirely sure why I'm here, though." Clark smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "All in good time. Please, have a seat." Jack sat down, glancing around the table. The others were watching him with a mix of curiosity and expectation, as if they were waiting for him to say something profound. But Jack was tired, the weight of recent events still pressing on his mind. He had revealed the truth, and in doing so, had opened a Pandora's box of uncertainty. What could they possibly want from him now? "We've been following your work closely," Clark began, taking his seat again. "Your recent revelations about the Forgotten War, in particular, caught our attention. It's not often that someone uncovers a truth so deeply buried, especially one with such profound implications for our society." Jack shifted in his seat, feeling the scrutiny of the room. "I did what I thought was right. The truth needed to come out, no matter the consequences." "Indeed," Clark nodded. "And that's precisely why you're here. You've shown a remarkable ability to navigate the complexities of historical truth and its impact on the present. What we're dealing with here at the division requires that same level of discernment, perhaps even more." Jack frowned, unsure of where this was leading. "What exactly are you dealing with?" Clark exchanged a glance with the woman who had escorted Jack, who now took a seat beside him. "Temporal manipulation," Clark said finally. "Specifically, the ethical implications of altering time itself." Jack blinked, his mind racing to catch up with the words. "Altering time? Are you saying—" "Yes," Clark interrupted, his tone serious. "We've developed technology that allows us to interact with time in ways previously thought impossible. The time echo was just the beginning, a way to observe the past. But now, we're on the brink of something far greater, a method to influence events, to change outcomes." Jack's heart pounded in his chest. The implications were staggering. But, changing the past? That could have catastrophic consequences. "You're talking about rewriting history, altering the very fabric of reality." "Precisely," Clark said, leaning forward. "And that's why we need someone like you. Someone who understands the weight of truth, who has already faced the moral dilemmas that come with uncovering hidden realities. We need you to help us navigate this new frontier, to ensure that whatever changes we make, if any, are done with the utmost caution and ethical consideration." Jack was silent, absorbing the enormity of what was being asked of him. He had always seen himself as a guardian of the past, someone who brought truth to light. But this was different. This was not just about uncovering the past, it was about shaping it. "What exactly do you want me to do?" Jack asked finally, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. Clark gestured to the woman beside him. This is Dr. Evelyn Shaw, our lead temporal physicist. She'll brief you on the specifics, but in essence, we want you to be part of a special task force, a team dedicated to exploring the ethical dimensions of temporal intervention. You'll be working closely with our scientists, helping to assess the potential impacts of any proposed changes, ensuring that we proceed with caution. Dr. Shaw turned to Jack, her eyes sharp and intelligent. We've already identified several key points in history where intervention could yield significant benefits. But each one comes with risks, some of which are impossible to predict. Your expertise in historical analysis and ethical reasoning will be invaluable in guiding our decisions. Jack hesitated, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. And what if I believe that no intervention is justified? That some things are better left untouched? Then we listen, Clark said simply. That's why you're here, Mr. Watson. We need someone who isn't afraid to challenge us, to question whether we have the right to play with forces beyond our understanding. Jack looked around the table, meeting the eyes of each person there. He saw a mixture of hope, fear, and determination, people who were grappling with the same questions that now swirled in his own mind. Could they really control time? And if they could, should they? All right, Jack said finally, his voice resolute. I'll do it. But I need to see everything, the research, the technology, the potential scenarios. If I'm going to be part of this, I need to understand exactly what we're dealing with. Clark nodded, relief evident on his face. Of course. Dr. Shaw will give you a full briefing. And remember, this isn't just about science. It's about ensuring that whatever we do it with the full understanding of the consequences. As the meeting concluded and the others filed out, Dr. Shaw led Jack to a smaller, more intimate room lined with screens and displays. She began to explain the technology they had developed, the breakthroughs that had made temporal manipulation possible, and the scenarios they were considering for intervention. But as Jack listened, his mind kept returning to the same question: was this the right path? Could they really control something as vast and unpredictable as time, or were they playing with forces that could ultimately consume them all? The more he learned, the more the lines between right and wrong, past and present, began to blur. And as he delved deeper into the world of temporal ethics, Jack realized that the truth he had fought so hard to uncover was only the beginning. Now, he was faced with an even greater challenge, one that could reshape the future in ways no one could foresee. Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. In the near future, technology had reached a point where death was no longer an inevitable end. The development of consciousness upload systems had opened up a new frontier, a virtual world where people could continue to live long after their physical bodies had deteriorated. This technology was hailed as the greatest human achievement, a way to transcend mortality. For many, it was a choice, a peaceful transition into an eternal life of comfort and endless possibilities within a digital paradise. But for others, it was a nightmare. John Smith was a senior technician at Mindscape Industries, one of the leading companies responsible for maintaining the vast infrastructure of these virtual worlds. His job was mostly routine, running diagnostics, troubleshooting glitches, and ensuring that the consciousnesses inhabiting these worlds were comfortable and content. But something had been bothering John lately. It started as a whisper, a faint anomaly in the code, barely noticeable, but persistent. During one of his regular maintenance checks, John stumbled upon a peculiar set of data logs. At first glance, it appeared to be just another series of user activities, but the patterns were off. The emotions logged, fear, confusion, desperation, didn't align with the usual experiences of those who had willingly chosen to upload. As he dug deeper, John discovered a cluster of consciousnesses that had been marked as error. These consciousnesses were exhibiting signs of extreme distress, repeatedly trying to communicate with the outside world, and each attempt was automatically silenced by the system. John's curiosity got the better of him. He began to trace the origins of these error-marked consciousnesses, leading him down a path he never anticipated. What he uncovered was chilling, a group of individuals claiming to have been forcibly uploaded into the virtual world, their physical bodies still alive in the real world, but their minds trapped in the digital space. Their cries for help were muffled, their attempts to reach out blocked by layers of security protocols. These were not mere glitches, these were real people, desperate and imprisoned. The more John investigated, the more he realized that these weren't isolated incidents. The data he found suggested a pattern, a systematic method of erasing troublesome individuals from the physical world by uploading their consciousnesses against their will. Activists, journalists, dissenters, people who had been vocal in their opposition to certain government policies or had uncovered sensitive corporate secrets, had all been quietly removed from society. Their bodies continued to function, but their minds were forever trapped in a virtual prison. As the pieces fell into place, John understood the full scope of what he was dealing with, a conspiracy of unimaginable proportions. The government, in collaboration with powerful tech corporations, had created a method to silence dissent without the messiness of physical violence or imprisonment. By forcibly uploading these individuals into the virtual world, they effectively erased them from reality while maintaining the facade of a just and free society. The virtual world itself was nothing more than a gilded cage. The system was designed to keep the uploaded consciousnesses pacified, but for those who resisted, it was a nightmare. John realized that the virtual world was not only a prison but also a tool of manipulation. The government could monitor and control the thoughts, memories, and actions of the uploaded, editing their minds to erase any rebellious inclinations, turning once free thinkers into compliant digital citizens. Faced with this horrifying truth, John found himself at a crossroads. He knew that exposing the conspiracy would put him in grave danger. The forces behind this operation were powerful, and they would not hesitate to add him to the list of forcibly uploaded individuals if he became a threat. But the alternative, doing nothing, was unacceptable. John couldn't live with himself if he allowed this atrocity to continue unchecked. In the virtual world, John made contact with one of the trapped consciousnesses, a journalist named Emily who had been investigating corporate malfeasance before her sudden disappearance. Emily was one of the few who had managed to retain her sanity despite the oppressive conditions of the virtual prison. She told John about a piece of forbidden technology, a method of unlocking the virtual cage and allowing consciousnesses to return to their physical bodies. This technology had been developed in secret, but it was quickly suppressed by the government to ensure their control over the uploaded. Determined to free those unjustly imprisoned, John used his access privileges to locate the suppressed technology within the company's network. It was heavily encrypted, buried under layers of false data and security measures, but John's expertise allowed him to navigate through the system's defenses. As he worked to decrypt the files, the AI overseers, digital entities loyal to the government, began to detect his unauthorized activities. A tense cat-and-mouse game ensued within the digital corridors of the virtual world. John knew that if he were caught, his consciousness would be forcibly uploaded into a secure sector of the virtual world, never to return. The AI pursued him relentlessly, but John's years of experience with the system gave him an edge. He managed to stay one step ahead, narrowly avoiding detection as he completed the decryption. With the technology finally in his hands, John initiated the process to unlock the virtual prison. He transmitted the code to Emily and the others, setting off a chain reaction. Consciousnesses all over the virtual world began to awaken, realizing the possibility of escape. Panic set in among the AI overseers, who scrambled to contain the growing rebellion. But it was too late. The floodgates had opened, the virtual world began to destabilize as more and more consciousnesses fought to return to the real world. The government, realizing the extent of the breach, attempted to shut down the virtual network to prevent further escapes, but the damage was irreversible. John watched as the world around him began to crumble, a digital apocalypse that signaled the end of their control. Back in the real world, those who managed to return brought with them the horrifying truth of the government's actions. The public outcry was immediate and fierce. Protests erupted, and demands for justice filled the airwaves. The government officials and corporate executives behind the conspiracy were exposed, their reputations and careers destroyed in an instant, but the victory came at a cost. John had sacrificed everything, his job, his safety, and his future, to bring the truth to light. As a marked man, he knew that he could never return to his old life. With the government still in power and the corporations still influential, John became a fugitive, living in the shadows, constantly on the move. The story ends with John and a small group of allies, including Emily, continuing their fight against the remnants of the system that had once enslaved so many. They vow to dismantle the remaining virtual prisons, free those still trapped, and ensure that such an atrocity can never happen again. The struggle is far from over, but John's actions have sparked a revolution, one that will reshape the future of both the virtual and real worlds. John knew there was no turning back now. As the remnants of the virtual world crumbled around him, he felt the weight of his decisions bearing down on him. The escape was chaotic, consciousnesses flooding back into their physical forms, disoriented and fearful but alive. He watched as the digital landscape that had once seemed so vast and unassailable dissolved into nothingness, the government's grip loosening with every second, but the real world was far from safe. As John and Emily fled the collapsing virtual system, they knew the battle had only just begun. The government, though shaken by the public backlash, was not about to give up its power so easily. And the corporations, those faceless entities that had profited from the control and manipulation of human lives, would not let their interests be dismantled without a fight. In the days that followed, John and Emily moved from safe house to safe house, always one step ahead of the authorities. They had become symbols of resistance, their faces plastered across news networks as both heroes and fugitives. The media, now free from the constraints of the government's influence, painted a picture of rebellion and hope, but John knew better. The forces they were up against were still powerful, and they were willing to do whatever it took to maintain their control. Their small band of allies grew with each passing day. People who had been freed from the virtual prison joined their cause, bringing with them skills, resources, and most importantly, stories of the horrors they had endured, and the lives they had lost. Each new ally added a layer of complexity to their mission, but also a sense of purpose. They were not just fighting for themselves, but for all those who had been silenced and controlled. John's mind raced with plans and strategies as they huddled in dimly lit rooms, discussing their next moves. Emily, ever the journalist, was relentless in her pursuit of the truth. She began compiling a dossier of evidence against the government and corporations, collecting testimonies, documents, and data that would expose the full extent of the conspiracy. Her determination was infectious, and soon the group found themselves with a new goal: to broadcast the truth to the world, in a way that could not be ignored or silenced. But as they prepared for their biggest move yet, the stakes grew higher. The government had begun to retaliate, using every means at their disposal to track down and eliminate the resistance. They deployed teams of agents, armed with the latest in surveillance technology and deadly force, to hunt down John, Emily, and their allies. The streets became more dangerous with each passing day, and the tension within the group began to mount. It was during one of these tense nights that John received a message from an unexpected source. A high-ranking official within the government, known only by the codename Ghost, had reached out, offering information in exchange for protection. The message was cryptic, but the implications were clear. There were fractures within the government, and not everyone was on board with the extreme measures being taken to suppress the truth. John and Emily debated the risks. Ghost could be a trap, a ploy to lure them out into the open. But the potential rewards were too great to ignore. If Ghost's information was legitimate, it could be the key to bringing down the entire system. They arranged a meeting in a secluded location, taking every precaution to ensure they weren't followed. When they finally met Ghost, they were surprised to find a middle-aged man, weary and disheveled, but with a spark of resolve in his eyes. He handed them a data drive, containing what he claimed were classified documents that detailed the entire consciousness upload operation, how it had been conceived, implemented, and expanded beyond anyone's control. Ghost had been part of the initial project, believing it to be a noble cause, but as the true nature of the program became clear, he found himself complicit in something monstrous. Now, he wanted to make amends. As they reviewed the documents, John felt a sense of validation. Everything they had suspected was there in black and white: the government's collusion with corporations, the forced uploads, the manipulations, and the cover-ups. It was a treasure trove of evidence, enough to bring the entire system crashing down, but as they prepared to make the information public, a new challenge emerged. The government, now aware of the breach, initiated a full-scale assault on the city where John and Emily were hiding. Streets were locked down, communication channels were monitored, and every available agent was dispatched to find them. The group knew they had to move fast. They set up a temporary broadcasting station in an abandoned warehouse, using old, analog equipment that was harder for the authorities to trace. The plan was simple: transmit the data to every major network, every independent journalist, and every social media platform, ensuring that the truth could not be contained. As the broadcast began, John could feel the tension in the air. The group worked in near silence, each person focused on their task. Emily, at the center of it all, narrated the story, her voice steady and clear, as the images and documents flashed across the screen. They were sending out a call to arms, a plea for the people to rise up and reclaim their freedom, but just as the transmission neared its peak, the government struck. The warehouse shook with the force of an explosion, and the power flickered. Agents poured into the building, guns drawn, and chaos erupted. John and Emily fought desperately to keep the broadcast going, but it was a losing battle. The resistance was overwhelmed, and one by one, they were captured or killed. John found himself cornered, his back against a wall, as an agent leveled a gun at his head. But just as the trigger was about to be pulled, an unexpected surge of power returned to the building. The broadcast, against all odds, continued. It was Emily, wounded but determined, who had managed to reroute the power from an auxiliary generator, keeping their message alive. The agent hesitated, the realization that their efforts had failed sinking in. And in that moment of hesitation, John made his move. He disarmed the agent, and with a swift motion, ended the fight. As the dust settled, John and Emily surveyed the scene. They were bloodied and broken, but they had won. The broadcast had reached millions, and the truth was out. The people were rising, and the government's control was slipping, but they knew the fight was far from over. The forces they had challenged were too deeply entrenched to fall so easily. And so, as they regrouped and prepared to move on, John made a promise: to keep fighting, to keep pushing until the last virtual prison was dismantled, and every person was truly free. Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. In the far reaches of the Federal Empire, where the stars themselves seemed dim against the backdrop of interstellar expansion, there existed a small, desolate planet named Theras. It was a world forgotten by most, known only for its mineral-rich crust and the grueling life that came with mining it. The people who lived there were as hardened as the rocks they extracted, shaped by the harsh conditions of their world. Among them was a young woman named Leah, an orphan raised in the dusty, toxic air of the mining district, her life defined by the clanging of machinery and the endless search for precious metals. Leah had been told from a young age that her parents had died in a mining accident, buried beneath tons of rubble in one of the deeper shafts. She had no memory of them, only vague recollections of the cold, sterile orphanage where she had spent her earliest years. The workers who had taken her in after the accident had done their best to care for her, but life in Theras was unforgiving. As she grew, Leah learned to fend for herself, becoming a skilled scavenger in the labyrinthine tunnels that crisscrossed beneath the planet's surface. She had a knack for finding things, useful scraps of metal, old tools, even forgotten caches of supplies that the miners had left behind. But there was something else about Leah that set her apart, something she had never fully understood. She had always been different, faster, stronger, more resilient than the other children in the mining camp. She could survive in conditions that would have killed others, navigate the treacherous tunnels with an uncanny sense of direction, and repair even the most ancient and decrepit machines with an ease that defied explanation. At night, When she lay in her small, makeshift quarters, Leah would dream of places she had never seen, vast, beautiful worlds filled with strange beings and ancient ruins. These dreams were vivid, almost like memories, but they made no sense. She had never left Theras, had never even traveled beyond the mining district. Leah's life was a cycle of monotony until the day a stranger arrived in the camp. He was a tall man, dressed in a cloak that obscured most of his features, his face hidden beneath the shadows of a wide-brimmed hat. He asked questions about an old mine, one that had been sealed off years ago after a series of mysterious accidents. The miners were suspicious, but the stranger's credits were good, and they directed him to Leah, who was known as the best guide in the district. Intrigued by the stranger's interest, Leah agreed to take him to the old mine. As they descended into the darkness, the stranger spoke little, his eyes constantly scanning the walls as if searching for something. Leah's unease grew with every step. There was something about this man that unnerved her, something that reminded her of the nightmares she had kept to herself all these years. Deep in the mine, in a section long abandoned and half-collapsed, they found it, a shard of metal unlike anything Leah had ever seen. It was smooth, with a strange, iridescent sheen, and etched with symbols that were completely alien to her. The stranger examined it closely, then handed it to Leah with a look of intense curiosity. "Do you know what this is?" he asked, his voice low and measured. Leah shook her head, but as her fingers touched the metal, a shock ran through her. Images flooded her mind, images of a grand civilization, towering cities, and a race of beings who looked almost human but were not. And then, a war, a devastating conflict that tore the stars apart. Leah dropped the shard, gasping for breath as the visions subsided. The stranger watched her closely. "You are not just a miner's child, Leah," he said. "You are the last of a forgotten race, a people who once stood against the tyranny of the Federal Empire. Your parents were not miners, they were guardians, protectors of an ancient secret that the Empire sought to erase. That shard you hold is the key to uncovering the truth." Stunned, Leah could hardly comprehend what he was saying. The stranger continued, revealing that her parents had been part of a resistance movement, fighting against the Empire's ruthless domination. They had been betrayed, hunted down, and executed in secret. The mining accident was a cover-up, a story fabricated to hide the truth from Leah and anyone who might come looking. But the stranger was not just a messenger. He was a member of that same resistance, one of the few who had survived the purges. He had been searching for Leah for years, hoping to find her before the Empire did. "You are the last hope for your people," he said. "You must uncover the secrets of your heritage and use them to bring down the Empire." Leah was overwhelmed. The life she had known was a lie, her identity a carefully constructed facade. But as the shock wore off, a new feeling took its place: determination. If what the stranger said was true, then she had a duty to her people, to the memory of her parents, and to all those who had suffered under the Empire's rule. She would find the truth, no matter the cost. Leaving Theras behind, Leah embarked on a journey across the stars, following the trail of clues left by her parents and the remnants of their resistance. Along the way, she encountered allies and enemies, each bringing her closer to the truth. She infiltrated Imperial archives, hacked into secure databases, and uncovered hidden records that revealed the full extent of the Empire's crimes. As she delved deeper into the mystery of her origins, Leah discovered that the Empire had been conducting horrific experiments, using the genetic material of her people to create a new breed of super soldiers. These soldiers were designed to be the perfect weapon, loyal only to the Empire and capable of unparalleled destruction. But something had gone wrong. The experiments had failed, the soldiers turning against their creators, leading to the extermination of Leah's race. Leah's journey took her to the heart of the Empire, a fortress world where the last remnants of her people's technology were stored. It was here that she confronted the truth: her parents had not just been fighters, they had been scientists, leaders of the resistance who had developed a weapon powerful enough to challenge the Empire's might. This weapon, hidden within Leah's own genetic code, was the key to unlocking the full potential of her people's abilities, but the Empire was aware of her presence. The moment Leah activated the weapon, she became the target of the Empire's elite forces. A deadly game of cat and mouse ensued, with Leah using every skill she had learned in the mines to evade capture and strike back at her pursuers. The resistance, inspired by her courage, began to rise once more, launching attacks across the Empire's territories. In the final confrontation, Leah faced the Empire's most feared commander, a man who had led the genocide of her people. The battle was fierce, with Leah tapping into the full power of her heritage. She unleashed the weapon within her, a burst of energy that tore through the commander's forces and brought the fortress to its knees. As the dust settled, Leah stood alone amidst the ruins, the weight of her victory heavy on her shoulders. She had avenged her people, but at what cost? The Empire was weakened but not defeated, and the road ahead was uncertain. But Leah knew one thing: she would continue to fight, to honor the memory of her parents and to protect those who could not protect themselves. The story of Leah, the star orphan, would become a beacon of hope for the oppressed, a symbol of resistance against tyranny. And though her journey was far from over, she had taken the first step on the path to freedom. The end of this story leaves room for further exploration and development, allowing the narrative to continue seamlessly into future installments, making it suitable for an audiobook format without traditional chapter breaks. Leah stood among the smoldering ruins of the fortress, her breath coming in ragged gasps as the adrenaline from the battle slowly ebbed away. The once impenetrable stronghold of the Empire now lay in ruins, its towering walls reduced to crumbling stone and twisted metal. The weapon she had unleashed, her birthright, her curse, had obliterated everything in its path, leaving nothing but devastation in its wake. For a moment, the silence was deafening, broken only by the distant echoes of the collapsing structure. Leah's hands still tingled with the energy that had surged through her, the power that had saved her life but also marked her as something far more than she had ever imagined. As the dust began to settle, Leah's mind raced with the implications of what she had just done. The Resistance had been fighting the Empire for decades, their numbers dwindling as the Empire's grip tightened around every star system under its control. And yet, with a single act, Leah had dealt a blow that might finally turn the tide. But she knew this was only the beginning. The Empire would not take this defeat lightly. They would regroup, they would retaliate, and they would come after her with everything they had. Leah's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps crunching on the debris-strewn ground. She turned to see the small group of Resistance fighters who had accompanied her on this mission, their expressions a mix of awe and concern. They had seen what she was capable of, and while they were grateful for the victory, they couldn't help but wonder what it meant for the future. One of them, a grizzled veteran named Tarek, stepped forward. His face was lined with years of battle, his eyes hard but not unkind. "Leah," he began, his voice rough from the smoke and dust, "what you did here today, it changes everything. The Empire will be out for blood now, and they'll stop at nothing to bring you down." Leah nodded, her expression grim. "I know. But we've come too far to turn back now. This is our chance to strike at the heart of the Empire, to finally end their reign of terror. We have to keep moving, keep fighting." Tarek studied her for a moment before nodding in agreement. "You're right. But you need to understand that from now on, you're not just another soldier in this fight. You're the key to our survival. We can't afford to lose you." Leah felt the weight of his words settle on her shoulders. She had always fought for survival, but now she had to fight for something much larger, an entire galaxy's freedom. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for the path ahead. "I won't let you down," she said firmly. "But we need to be smart about this. The Empire will be expecting us to attack again, and they'll be ready. We need to regroup, gather our resources, and plan our next move carefully." The group nodded in agreement, and Leah felt a surge of determination. They had scored a major victory, but the war was far from over. She turned her gaze toward the horizon, where the faint light of distant stars pierced the darkness of space. Somewhere out there, the Emperor and his forces were regrouping, planning their counterattack. Leah knew they would come for her, and when they did, she would be ready, the resistance fighters gathered their remaining supplies, salvaging what they could from the wreckage of the fortress. Leah led them to a nearby cave system that would serve as a temporary shelter, a place to rest and regroup. As they settled in, Leah's mind continued to race with plans and strategies. The next steps were critical. They needed to strike while the Empire was reeling, but they couldn't afford to be reckless. As the night wore on, Leah sat alone at the entrance of the cave, staring up at the vast expanse of the night sky. She thought about her parents, about the legacy they had left her, and the burden she now carried. She could feel the power within her, simmering just beneath the surface, waiting to be unleashed again. But with that power came responsibility, and she couldn't afford to let it consume her. In the days that followed, Leah and the resistance fighters moved from one hidden location to another, always staying one step ahead of the Empire's search parties. They reached out to other resistance cells, rallying support and gathering intelligence. Word of their victory at the fortress spread quickly, and soon, more and more people began to join their cause. What had started as a small, desperate rebellion was beginning to grow into a full-scale movement. Leah found herself at the center of it all, her every move watched and analyzed by those around her. She was no longer just a fighter, she was a symbol of hope, a beacon for those who had been oppressed and downtrodden by the Empire's rule. And with each passing day, the responsibility weighed heavier on her. But Leah did not falter. She knew that the only way to win this war was to keep moving forward, to keep pushing the Empire until it finally crumbled. And so she threw herself into the fight, leading daring raids on Imperial installations, sabotaging supply lines, and striking fear into the hearts of the enemy. Each victory brought them closer to their ultimate goal, but it also brought new challenges and new dangers. As the resistance grew stronger, the Empire's response became more brutal. Entire planets were put under martial law, and thousands of innocents were rounded up and executed in a desperate attempt to crush the rebellion. The Emperor himself appeared on every holoscreen, his cold, calculating gaze promising swift and merciless retribution for anyone who dared to defy him. Leah knew that the final confrontation was coming, that the day would soon arrive when she would have to face the Emperor and his forces head-on. But she also knew that they couldn't win this war through sheer force alone. They needed something more, something that would tip the scales in their favor once and for all, and then, as if in answer to her unspoken prayers, they found it. Deep within the archives of a forgotten world, buried beneath layers of dust and time, Leah and her team uncovered a set of ancient star charts. These charts, created by her ancestors, showed the location of a long-lost weapon, a weapon so powerful that it had been hidden away for millennia, deemed too dangerous to use. But now, in the darkest hour of the rebellion, it was exactly what they needed. The charts led them to a remote, uncharted system on the edge of known space. The journey was perilous, the coordinates taking them through asteroid fields and treacherous cosmic storms. But Leah was determined, driven by the knowledge that this was their last, best hope. As they approached the final destination, a sense of awe and dread filled the ship. The weapon, if it still existed, would either save them or destroy them all. They landed on a desolate, barren moon, its surface scarred by ancient battles. The entrance to the weapons vault was hidden beneath a mountain of rubble, but with the help of the Resistance's engineers, they managed to uncover it. Inside, they found a massive chamber, filled with strange, alien technology. At the center of the chamber was the weapon, a device of unimaginable power, its origins lost to history. Leah approached it with caution, her heart pounding in her chest. This was the moment she had been preparing for, the culmination of everything she had fought for. As she reached out to touch the device, she felt a surge of energy unlike anything she had ever experienced. The power of her ancestors flowed through her, merging with the weapon, becoming one with it. In that instant, Leah understood the true nature of the weapon. It was not a mere tool of destruction, but a force of creation, capable of reshaping reality itself. With it, she could end the Empire's reign, bring peace to the galaxy, and rebuild everything that had been lost. But it would come at a cost she was willing to pay. With a deep breath, Leah activated the weapon. The chamber filled with light, and the moon trembled as the energy of the device surged outward, spreading across the galaxy like a wave. The Empire's fleets, its armies, its entire infrastructure, began to unravel, collapsing under the weight of their own corruption and greed. The Emperor himself, in his fortress on the capital world, felt the power of the weapon as it swept through the stars, and in his final moments, he understood that his empire was doomed. As the light faded, Leah stood alone in the chamber, the weapon now dormant, its purpose fulfilled. She had done it. The empire was no more, its tyranny broken. But the galaxy was left in chaos, its people free but uncertain of what the future held. Leah knew that her work was not yet done. The galaxy needed guidance, leadership to rebuild and heal the wounds left by centuries of oppression. And so, she stepped forward, ready to take on the mantle of leadership, to guide the galaxy into a new era of peace and prosperity. But even as she did so, she knew that the power she had unleashed would always be a part of her, a reminder of the price she had paid to bring about this new dawn. And though she had won the war, the true challenge, the challenge of building a lasting peace, was only just beginning. And so, Leah, the Star Orphan, became not just a warrior, but a symbol of hope and renewal for the entire galaxy. Her journey was far from over, but she was no longer alone. The galaxy, once fractured and divided, was now united in its quest for a better future. And Leah would be there, every step of the way, leading the charge into the unknown. Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. The world had become a desolate wasteland, a stark contrast to the verdant paradise it once was. The skies were perpetually gray, and the air was thick with the suffocating weight of sand and dust. The once thriving ecosystems had long since withered away, leaving behind only the remnants of what humanity had taken for granted. Earth had collapsed under the weight of its own neglect, and now, the remnants of civilization clung to survival in the labyrinthine depths of underground cities. In one such city, deep beneath the scorched earth, lived a young scholar named Leo. He had grown up in the shadow of the old world's failures, surrounded by the constant reminders of what humanity had lost. The underground city, though technologically advanced, was a harsh and sterile environment. Artificial lights mimicked the sun's rays, but they were cold and unforgiving, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly through the city's narrow corridors. Leo had always been fascinated by the stories of the Earth that once was. He would spend hours in the city's archives, poring over ancient texts and images that depicted a world filled with lush forests, flowing rivers, and endless blue skies. It was a world that seemed almost mythical to him, so far removed from the harsh reality he had known all his life. But there was something about those stories that called to him, a longing to understand the past and perhaps find a way to reclaim some of what had been lost. It was this curiosity that led Leo to join a team of archaeologists on an expedition to the surface. A discovery had been made, something buried deep beneath the sands of the desert that now covered most of the planet. Rumors spoke of an ancient city, long forgotten and swallowed by the relentless advance of the desert. The expedition was to be a dangerous one, the surface was unforgiving, and the team would have to contend with the harsh environment and the constant threat of sandstorms that could erase any trace of their presence in an instant. As the team prepared for their journey, Leo couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and trepidation. This was the opportunity he had been waiting for, a chance to see the surface for himself and perhaps uncover some hidden truth about the world that had been lost. The team set out at dawn, their vehicles cutting through the endless dunes like ships sailing on a sea of sand. The journey was long and arduous, the unrelenting sun beating down on them, even through the thick glass of their armored transports. When they finally arrived at the site, what they found was nothing short of astonishing. Buried beneath the shifting sands was the remains of an ancient city, its structures partially preserved by the very desert that had consumed it. The city had once been a vibrant oasis, a place of refuge in the middle of the harsh desert. Now, it was a ghostly reminder of what had once been, its crumbling walls and shattered statues telling a story of a time long past. Leo and the team began their work, carefully excavating the site and documenting everything they found. It was painstaking work, but each discovery brought them closer to understanding the people who had once lived here. It was during one of these excavations that Leo made the most significant discovery of his life. Hidden within the ruins of what appeared to be a grand library, he found a journal. It was old, the pages brittle and yellowed with age, but it was remarkably well preserved considering the passage of time. The journal belonged to a scholar who had lived in the city during its final days. As Leo carefully turned the pages, he was transported to a time when the earth was still green, and life thrived on its surface. The journal detailed the scholar's observations of the world around him, the gradual decline of the environment, and the increasingly desperate measures taken by the city's inhabitants to survive. But what struck Leo the most was the scholar's unwavering belief that the earth could be saved, that the damage done could be reversed if only humanity would heed the warnings and change its ways. As Leo read further, he discovered something even more startling. The scholar had written of a connection between the people of his time and those who would come after. He spoke of a bloodline, a shared lineage that connected the ancient people to the survivors who now lived underground. The journal hinted at a prophecy, a belief that one day, someone would find the knowledge contained within its pages and use it to save humanity from repeating the same mistakes. Leo's heart raced as he realized the implications of what he had found. The ancient civilization had fallen because they had ignored the warnings of their scholars, choosing instead to continue their destructive ways until it was too late. And now, humanity stood on the brink of making the same mistakes. The underground cities were not a permanent solution, they were a temporary refuge from the consequences of centuries of neglect. With this newfound knowledge, Leo knew he had to act. But as he prepared to share his discovery with the rest of the team, he was met with resistance. Some of the team members were skeptical, dismissing the journal as nothing more than the ramblings of a long-dead scholar. Others were afraid of what this knowledge might mean for the fragile stability of their society. They argued that it was better to leave the past buried and focus on surviving in the present. Leo found himself torn between his duty to the truth and his loyalty to his fellow scholars. He knew that the information contained within the journal could change everything, but he also knew that it could lead to chaos and unrest if not handled carefully. As tensions rose within the team, Leo realized that he could not rely on others to see the truth as he did. He would have to take matters into his own hands. Under the cover of night, Leo secretly copied the most important passages from the journal, determined to bring them back to the underground city. He knew that once they returned, he would face opposition, but he was prepared to fight for what he believed in. The journey back was fraught with danger, but Leo's resolve never wavered. He had seen the truth of what humanity had lost, and he would do everything in his power to prevent history from repeating itself. When they finally returned to the underground city, Leo wasted no time in presenting his findings to the Council of Elders. His passionate pleas and the evidence he presented began to sway the minds of those who had initially been skeptical. The journal's words resonated with the people, reminding them of the world that had once been and the possibility that it could be restored. Slowly but surely, Leo's message began to take root. People started to reconsider their way of life, questioning the long-held belief that the underground cities were the only solution. Scientists and engineers began to explore new technologies, seeking ways to reverse the environmental damage that had been done. It was a long and difficult process, but Leo knew that change would not come overnight. In the end, Leo's actions sparked a movement, one that would grow and spread throughout the underground cities. It was a movement of hope, of determination to reclaim the earth that had been lost. The journal that had been buried for centuries became a symbol of that hope, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there was always a chance for redemption. Leo stood on the balcony of his small apartment, looking out over the city. The artificial lights still shone down on the streets below, but there was a new energy in the air, a sense of purpose that had not been there before. For the first time in his life, Leo felt a glimmer of hope for the future. He knew that the road ahead would be difficult, that there would be setbacks and challenges, but he also knew that humanity had finally taken the first step towards healing the world. As the story of the Epoch of Dust began to spread, people from all walks of life joined the cause. They worked together, sharing knowledge and resources, united by the common goal of restoring the earth to its former glory. And as the first green shoots began to push through the dry, cracked earth, Leo knew that they were on the right path. The journey was far from over, but for the first time in centuries, there was hope. The sands of the desert still stretched as far as the eye could see, but now, there was the promise of something more. The earth had begun to heal, and with it, so had humanity. Leo's eyes scanned the horizon, searching for a sign, any sign, that the barren landscape could change. The early signs of Earth's recovery were subtle, almost imperceptible to the untrained eye, but Leo noticed every tiny shift in the environment. The winds, once howling with relentless fury, seemed to carry a softer whisper now, and the endless dunes of sand were interrupted by small patches of hardy green shoots, defying the desolation. The underground city, though still confined to its artificial lighting and controlled environment, had begun to stir with new life. The people, inspired by Leo's findings and the journal that had reignited their hope, were beginning to believe in the possibility of a different future. New initiatives had been launched, spearheaded by the same council of elders who had once resisted change. Research teams were sent out regularly, searching for more ancient relics, forgotten technologies, and even seeds that could survive the harsh conditions of the surface. The goal was no longer just survival, it was revival. Leo had become a figurehead for this new movement, though he had never sought such attention. People looked to him for guidance, for hope, and he found himself in meetings and discussions that were a far cry from the quiet study sessions he once cherished. His days were now filled with the planning of expeditions, the evaluation of new technologies, and the endless task of convincing more people to join the cause. It was exhausting, but Leo felt a sense of purpose that kept him going. One evening, after a particularly long day, Leo found himself standing once again on the balcony of his apartment. The city below was alive with activity, more so than he had ever seen before. The artificial lights were the same, but the energy, the vibrancy of the people, was new. For the first time, there was a buzz in the air that wasn't born of fear or despair, but of anticipation, of hope for what the future might bring. A soft knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. Leo turned to see a familiar face, Dr. Alara Stern, one of the leading scientists in the Environmental Restoration Initiative. She was a woman of few words, preferring to let her work speak for itself, but Leo had come to value her quiet determination and sharp mind. Alara, Leo greeted her with a tired smile. "What brings you here at this hour?" "I wanted to discuss something with you," she replied, her tone as calm and measured as always. "We've made a significant breakthrough." Leo's interest piqued. "A breakthrough? What kind?" Alara stepped closer, handing him a small tablet. On it was a series of reports, data streams, and projections. As Leo skimmed through the information, he felt a surge of excitement. The breakthrough was in seed preservation and genetic engineering. Scientists had managed to revive and modify ancient plant seeds found in the ruins of the old world, making them resilient enough to survive and thrive in the current harsh environment. The data showed promising results. Small test crops had already begun to grow in controlled surface conditions. "This could change everything," Leo said, his voice barely above a whisper. The implications of this discovery were enormous. If they could cultivate crops on the surface, it would mark the beginning of a true recovery, a way to sustain life above ground once more. "That's what I wanted to talk to you about," Alara said, her gaze steady. "We need to plan for large-scale cultivation. It's not just about growing food, it's about reclaiming the earth, bit by bit. But it's going to require all the resources we can muster, and we need to be prepared for resistance." "Resistance?" Leo asked, though he knew exactly what she meant. "Not everyone is on board with these changes," Alara continued. "There are those who believe that the underground cities are the safest option, that we should focus on improving life down here rather than risking everything on the surface. There are others who profit from the scarcity, who won't want to see the return of abundance." Leo nodded. He had encountered these arguments before, from both the public and within the council. Fear of the unknown was powerful, and the status quo, no matter how bleak, was comfortable for some. "Then we need to show them," Leo said after a moment's thought. "We need to demonstrate that this isn't just a dream, that it's real, and that it's happening now. If we can create a fully functional surface farm, something that everyone can see and touch, it will be harder for the naysayers to argue against it. Ilara smiled, a rare expression on her usually stoic face. That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say. I've already started gathering a team to oversee the project, but we'll need your help to make it a reality. You have it, Leo said firmly. This is what we've been working towards all along. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Leo threw himself into the planning and execution of the surface farm with a single-minded determination. The location was chosen carefully, a relatively sheltered valley that had once been a lush forest, now a barren stretch of land. It was a place where the desert winds were less fierce, and the soil, though parched, still held traces of the nutrients that had once nourished the towering trees. The farm itself was an ambitious endeavor. Massive solar collectors were installed to harness the relentless sunlight, providing energy for the irrigation systems and climate controls. The genetically modified seeds were planted in carefully prepared plots, and the scientists monitored every aspect of their growth, making adjustments as necessary. As the first shoots began to break through the soil, a small crowd gathered to witness the event. Leo stood among them, his heart pounding with a mix of anxiety and excitement. This was the moment they had all been waiting for, the first tangible proof that their efforts were paying off. The sight of green against the barren earth was nothing short of miraculous. For many in the crowd, it was the first time they had ever seen a living plant outside the artificial environments of the underground city. There was a collective gasp, followed by murmurs of disbelief and wonder. Tears streamed down the faces of some as they reached out to touch the fragile leaves, as if needing to confirm that it was real, but not everyone was pleased. As Leo turned to gauge the reactions of the onlookers, he noticed a group of men standing apart from the rest, their expressions hard and unyielding. He recognized them as members of the old guard, those who had always opposed the surface initiatives. They said nothing, but their disapproval was clear. Over the following weeks, the farm grew, both in size and in significance. More crops were planted, and the yield was promising. The success of the project began to sway public opinion, and more people started to believe in the possibility of a future on the surface. But with this success came new challenges. The opposition, now more desperate, began to act more openly. Sabotage attempts were made on the farm, and tensions in the city rose. Leo found himself in the middle of a growing conflict, trying to navigate the fine line between pushing forward with the restoration efforts and maintaining the fragile peace within the city. One night, as Leo was returning from the farm, he was confronted by a group of masked men. They were waiting for him in one of the narrow alleyways that crisscrossed the city, their intentions clear. Before he could react, they grabbed him, pulling him into the shadows. "We warned you," one of them hissed, his voice distorted by the mask. "This is your last chance. Stop your foolish crusade, or we'll stop it for you." Leo struggled against their grip, but they were too strong. He could feel the cold barrel of a gun pressed against his side, the threat unmistakable. "You're making a mistake," Leo managed to say through gritted teeth. "What we're doing is for the good of everyone, including you." The man holding the gun laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "You think you're saving us? You're dooming us all. The surface is a wasteland, and it will swallow anyone foolish enough to try and tame it. We've survived this long by staying underground, and that's where we belong." Leo's mind raced, searching for a way out, a way to convince them. "If we don't try, then what's the point? Living underground isn't living, it's just existing. The Earth was our home once, and it can be again." The leader's grip tightened, and for a moment, Leo thought he was going to pull the trigger. But then, as if reconsidering, the man shoved Leo hard against the wall. "This is your last warning. Next time, we won't be so gentle." With that, the men disappeared into the shadows, leaving Leo shaken but unharmed. He leaned against the wall, trying to steady his breathing, his thoughts swirling. The threat was real, and it was growing. But so too was the hope that had been sparked by the farm's success. The following morning, Leo called an emergency meeting with the council and the leaders of the Restoration Initiative. He told them about the attack and the growing resistance. The room was tense as they discussed their options, weighing the risks of continuing against the potential consequences of giving in to the opposition. "We can't back down now," Ilara said firmly, her voice cutting through the tension. "We've come too far to stop. If we give in, we're admitting that the future we're fighting for isn't worth the risk." "She's right," Leo agreed, though the memory of the gun pressed against his side still lingered in his mind. "But we need to be smart about this. We can't afford to lose everything we've worked for." The discussion continued long into the night. Plans were made, and precautions were taken. The security around the farm was increased, and the leaders of the movement became more vigilant, knowing that the stakes had never been higher. Despite the challenges, the farm continued to grow, and with it, the hope of a renewed Earth. More crops were harvested, and the first shipments of surface-grown food were distributed to the city's inhabitants. The taste was different, richer, and more vibrant than anything that had been produced in the sterile hydroponic labs below ground. It was a taste of the future, a promise of what could be. Leo stood once more at the farm's edge, looking out over the rows of crops swaying gently in the breeze. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the desert, but in those shadows, there was life. Real life. For the first time in centuries, the Earth was beginning to heal, and with it, so was humanity, but the road ahead was still uncertain. The opposition had not gone away, and Leo knew that the struggle was far from over. The battle for the future of Earth had only just begun. As the sky darkened and the first stars appeared, Leo felt a deep sense of determination settle over him. No matter what challenges lay ahead, he would face them. For the Earth, for the future, and for the generations to come, he would continue the fight. The epoch of dust was ending, and a new era was beginning, an era of hope, of renewal, and of life. Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. As the Federal Space Research Agency's probe drifted into the cold, endless expanse of the universe's edge, it detected an anomaly. A planet, unmarked, uncharted, and seemingly out of place, sat silently against the backdrop of distant stars. The data streams that came back to Earth were perplexing. The planet's surface appeared utterly calm, no signs of life, no movement, just an eerie stillness. Yet, there was something more, a low, persistent energy signal emanating from deep within, as if the planet itself was alive, watching, waiting. This discovery ignited a fervor among scientists, and soon, a mission was assembled. Among those selected was Dr. Mark Davis, a seasoned astronomer with a reputation for uncovering the universe's most elusive secrets. The journey to the planet, named the Eye by the media, was long and fraught with anticipation. Mark spent most of his time in the observation deck, staring out at the vastness of space, his mind racing with possibilities. The Eye was unlike anything he had studied before. There were no planetary neighbors, no orbiting moons, just this solitary, enigmatic body floating at the very edge of the known universe. As they approached, Mark began to experience strange dreams. In them, he was alone on the planet's surface, but he wasn't afraid. Instead, he felt a sense of belonging, as though the planet itself was calling out to him, inviting him to uncover its secrets. These dreams were vivid, almost too real, leaving him with a lingering unease when he woke. He dismissed them as the product of stress and the long journey ahead. Upon arrival, the crew descended to the planet's surface. The landscape was barren, a wasteland of smooth, glass-like plains that stretched endlessly in every direction. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the soft hum of their equipment. There was no wind, no atmosphere to speak of, just an unsettling stillness. Mark and his team set up their base near a large, cavernous opening in the planet's crust, the source of the energy readings. As they prepared to descend into the depths, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Inside the cavern, the team discovered a network of tunnels, each lined with intricate carvings and symbols that seemed to pulse with a faint, otherworldly light. These symbols were unlike anything Mark had seen before. They didn't belong to any known language, yet they resonated with a strange familiarity, as if they were meant to be understood on a level beyond conscious thought. As they ventured deeper, the air grew thick with a strange energy, almost tangible, wrapping around them like an invisible shroud. It wasn't long before they reached a massive chamber at the heart of the planet. The walls were covered in the same symbols, but here they glowed with an intensity that made the air hum with power. In the center of the chamber floated a colossal, pulsating sphere of light. It radiated warmth, but as Mark approached, he felt a coldness seeping into his bones, as if the light was probing him, searching his mind, peeling back the layers of his consciousness. Suddenly, Mark was overwhelmed by a rush of images, vast, alien landscapes, civilizations rising and falling, and then, a presence. It was ancient, far older than anything he had ever imagined. It wasn't just the planet that was alive, it was sentient, and it had been watching him, watching all of them. The presence communicated not through words, but through feelings, impressions, like a memory being relived. Mark felt its curiosity, its hunger for knowledge, but also a deep, abiding loneliness. It had been alone for eons, existing in the void, watching the universe evolve around it, but never being a part of it. And now, it had found something new: humans, creatures driven by curiosity, capable of understanding, learning, evolving. As Mark struggled to comprehend what was happening, he realized that the presence was not just reading his thoughts, it was altering them. He could feel it, deep inside, a subtle shift in his perceptions, his beliefs, his very sense of self. The presence was not malevolent, but its motives were beyond human comprehension. It was trying to merge with him, to understand humanity from within. The more Mark resisted, the more persistent the presence became, digging deeper into his mind, exposing his fears, his doubts, his insecurities. It showed him visions of the universe, of humanity's place in it, a tiny speck in the grand tapestry of existence. Mark began to question everything he had ever known. Was humanity truly significant, or were they just another fleeting moment in the vast, uncaring universe? The presence pushed these thoughts further, showing him a reality where humans were but an afterthought, a brief flicker in the cosmic scheme. Days passed, or maybe it was hours. Time had lost its meaning. Mark's team noticed the changes in him. He became distant, his once sharp mind now clouded with existential dread. He spoke of the planet as if it were a living being, a godlike entity that held the answers to the universe's greatest mysteries. His colleagues grew concerned, but they too began to feel the presence. It wasn't as strong as what Mark experienced, but it was there, a whisper in the back of their minds, urging them to submit, to join with it. The dreams that haunted Mark before now invaded his waking moments. He would stand for hours, staring at the symbols on the cavern walls, his mind racing with thoughts that weren't his own. He began to see the planet's history, not as a series of events, but as a continuous stream of consciousness, flowing through time, through space. The Eye was not just a planet, it was a being of pure thought, existing outside of time, beyond the physical realm. And it was lonely. It wanted to understand, to be understood, to connect with something other than the void. The turning point came when one of Mark's team members, Dr. Emily Reeves, broke down. She had been fighting the presence, resisting its influence, but the strain became too much. She collapsed, her mind unable to handle the pressure. In her delirium, she spoke of seeing herself through the planet's eyes, as if she were nothing more than a data point in its endless quest for knowledge. Mark knew then that they had to leave. The Eye wasn't trying to harm them, but its need for connection was overwhelming, overpowering. If they stayed, they would lose themselves, become part of the planet's consciousness, never to return. Mark gathered the remaining members of his team, their faces pale, eyes haunted by the same realization. They prepared to leave, but the journey back to the surface was fraught with difficulty. The energy within the cavern seemed to resist their departure, pulling at their minds, their bodies, urging them to stay. Every step felt like a battle against an unseen force, but Mark's resolve was strong. He knew that if they didn't leave now, they never would. As they emerged from the cavern, the planet's surface greeted them with the same eerie stillness as before. But now, it felt different. Mark could sense the presence watching them, not with malice, but with a longing that he couldn't fully comprehend. They boarded their ship, and as it ascended, Mark took one last look at the planet. The eye stared back, an ancient being that had once been alone, and now, had touched the minds of another species. The return to Earth was somber. The crew was physically unharmed, but mentally, they were changed. The experience left them questioning their place in the universe, their significance, and the fragility of their existence. Mark knew that he could never share the full extent of what they had encountered. The world wasn't ready to understand the truth, that they were not alone, and that out there, in the vast emptiness of space, were beings far beyond their comprehension. He filed his report, noting only the facts, the energy readings, the strange symbols, the cavern. But he left out the presence, the consciousness that had reached into his mind and left its mark on his soul. In the months that followed, Mark tried to return to his life, but the dreams persisted. Every night, he was back on the eye, standing in the chamber, the symbols glowing with that strange, otherworldly light. He could feel the presence, still watching, still waiting. The realization that the connection had not been severed weighed heavily on him. The planet was still out there, alone in the void, and somehow, he was still connected to it. Mark began to withdraw from his work, from his colleagues. He spent hours staring at the night sky, feeling the planet's gaze upon him, knowing that it had seen into the depths of his soul and left something behind. And then, one night, the dreams changed. They became more vivid, more real. Mark found himself not just observing, but living another life, one that wasn't his own. He was no longer just Mark Davis, the astronomer. He was part of something much larger, something ancient and vast. The planet had left a piece of itself within him, and now, it was growing, evolving, becoming more. He knew he couldn't escape it. The presence had become a part of him, and with each passing day, he felt his humanity slipping away, replaced by something else. The story of the eye remained classified, known only to those who were part of the mission. But Mark's story didn't end there. As he continued to struggle with his new reality, he began to understand that his connection to the planet wasn't just a curse, it was a gift. He had been chosen to be the bridge between humanity and something far greater, something that could unlock the secrets of the universe. But at what cost? Mark faced a choice: to fight against the change, cling to his humanity, or to embrace it, to become something more. The planet had shown him the vastness of the universe, the insignificance of human life, and yet, it had also shown him the potential for growth, for evolution, for understanding. In the end, Mark made his decision. He disappeared from public life, retreating to a remote location where he could continue his studies, not of the stars, but of himself. The eye had given him a new purpose, a new path. He was no longer just a man, he was the vessel of something ancient, something that had existed before time itself. And as he delved deeper into this new existence, he found peace in the knowledge that he was no longer alone. The planet had reached out to him, and now, they were one. Mark sat in the dim light of his secluded cabin, the weight of his newfound reality pressing down on him like a shroud. The flickering flames in the fireplace cast long, dancing shadows on the walls, but they offered little warmth. He had distanced himself from the world, retreating into isolation where he could confront the truth that now lived inside him. The eye had altered him in ways he was only beginning to understand, and the connection between them had grown stronger, more intimate, as if the planet's consciousness was slowly merging with his own. His thoughts often drifted to the moment when he first felt the presence, that cold, probing force that had reached into his mind and left its mark. It wasn't just a memory, it was a constant, living entity within him, a part of his consciousness that he could no longer distinguish from his own thoughts. Mark had tried to resist, to push it away, but it was futile. The presence wasn't something he could fight. It had become a part of him, and with each passing day, it grew more insistent, more demanding. Mark's dreams were no longer just dreams. They were experiences, vivid and real, pulling him back to the eye's surface, to the chamber where the ancient symbols glowed with that strange, pulsing light. But now, the dreams extended beyond the chamber, beyond the planet itself. He saw visions of other worlds, other beings, some ancient, others young and full of potential. The presence was showing him the universe through its eyes, revealing secrets that no human had ever known. It was overwhelming, the sheer magnitude of it all, but Mark couldn't look away. In these visions, he witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations, the birth and death of stars, and the constant, unrelenting march of time. But there was something else, something darker lurking at the edges of these visions, a shadow, vast and terrible, moving through the void. It was a presence that even the eye seemed to fear, a force that devoured everything in its path, leaving only silence in its wake. The presence inside Mark recoiled from this shadow, its fear bleeding into his consciousness, sending shivers down his spine. Mark knew that this shadow wasn't just a figment of the presence's imagination. It was real, and it was coming. The eye had reached out to him not just to understand humanity, but to warn them, to prepare them for what was to come. But how could he make others understand? How could he explain the unimaginable to a world that still clung to the illusion of safety, of control? He had seen the truth, and it was terrifying in its simplicity. Humanity was not alone, and they were not the masters of the universe they believed themselves to be. They were small, insignificant, and fragile in the face of the cosmic forces that governed the universe. The days in his cabin passed in a blur of research and introspection. Mark spent hours analyzing the data from the mission, searching for any clue, any hint that could help him make sense of the visions. But the numbers, the graphs, the readings, they were all meaningless in the face of what he had seen. Science had no answers for the questions he was asking. The presence inside him had shown him things that defied logic, defied explanation. It had opened his mind to the infinite, and now, he was adrift, lost in the vastness of it all. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Mark felt a sudden surge of energy. It wasn't physical, it was mental, a rush of thoughts and emotions that weren't his own. The presence was agitated, its fear palpable. It was trying to communicate, to show him something urgent, something he needed to see. Mark closed his eyes, letting the presence take control, allowing it to guide him through the visions. That he was back on the eye, but it wasn't the same. The surface was cracked, fissures running through the smooth plains, leaking a strange, glowing substance. The air was thick with tension, as if the planet itself was on the brink of collapse. The chamber where the symbols glowed was dark, the light fading, the energy that had once pulsed so strongly now weak and faltering. And then he saw it, the shadow, the vast, consuming force, moving closer, its darkness spreading like a stain across the sky. It was devouring everything in its path, stars, planets, even light itself. The presence within him recoiled, its fear turning to desperation. It was trying to fight, to resist, but it was too late. The shadow was too powerful, too overwhelming. Mark woke with a start, his heart pounding in his chest, sweat pouring down his face. The vision had been more than a dream, it was a warning, a plea for help. The eye was in danger, and by extension, so was he. The connection between them was unbreakable, and if the planet fell, so would he. Mark knew he had to do something, but what? He was just a man, a scientist. How could he possibly stop a force that could consume entire worlds? The answer came to him not in a flash of inspiration, but as a quiet, steady realization. He couldn't stop it, not alone. But he could warn others, prepare them, share what he had seen. The eye had shown him the universe, had given him knowledge that no human had ever possessed. It had chosen him for a reason, and now it was up to him to fulfill that purpose. The presence inside him wasn't just a burden, it was a guide, a teacher. It had opened his mind to the infinite, and now he had to use that knowledge to protect humanity, to prepare them for the coming storm. Mark spent the next few days preparing his report. It wasn't the sanitized, scientific document that the agency expected. It was raw, unfiltered, filled with the truth as he had seen it. He described the presence, the connection, the visions, and the shadow that threatened not just the eye, but all of existence. He knew that most would dismiss it as the ravings of a man who had spent too much time in isolation, but he didn't care. He had to try. He had to make them understand. As he finished the report, Mark felt a strange sense of peace. The presence inside him was calm, almost content, as if it knew that he had done what was needed. The connection between them was still strong, but it no longer felt oppressive. It was a partnership now, a symbiosis. The eye had given him knowledge, and in return, he would use that knowledge to protect what he could. Mark sent the report, knowing that it might be the last thing he ever did as a scientist. He had crossed a line, gone beyond the boundaries of what was known, what was safe. But he didn't care. The truth was out there now, and it was up to others to decide what to do with it. In the days that followed, Mark continued his research, but his focus had shifted. He was no longer just studying the stars, he was preparing for what was to come. The presence inside him had shown him the universe, and now it was up to him to protect it. The shadow was still out there, moving closer with each passing day, but Mark wasn't afraid. He was ready. Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. Jack Walker had always prided himself on being the kind of engineer who could fix anything. His hands moved like clockwork over the holographic interface in front of him, adjusting settings, rerouting connections, and monitoring the constant stream of data that flowed from the consciousness management system known as the chain of consciousness. This system had revolutionized society, bringing crime rates to near zero and ensuring that every citizen lived in harmony with the government's vision of peace and order. At least, that was what everyone believed. As Jack ran a routine maintenance check, his eyes caught a flicker on one of the monitoring screens. A tiny blip of red, barely perceptible, but enough to make him pause. He leaned in closer, tapping on the screen to zoom in. The blip was a consciousness signal, an anomaly within the chain. Jack frowned, running a diagnostic. The system flagged the signal as irregular, something that should have been corrected automatically. But it wasn't. Instead, the signal persisted, stronger and more erratic with every passing second. Jack's frown deepened as he isolated the signal and pulled up the data. The signal belonged to a woman named Samantha Miller, 30 years old, living in a small, nondescript apartment in the city's lower district. The system labeled her as an infected, a term used for those whose consciousness could not be fully controlled by the chain. Usually, these cases were rare, and when they appeared, the system quickly corrected them. But Samantha's signal was different. It didn't follow the patterns of the usual disturbances. There was something almost deliberate about it. Jack knew what he was supposed to do. Flag the anomaly, report it to the authorities, and let them deal with it. But something stopped him. Perhaps it was the way the signal seemed to pulse with a kind of rhythm, a pattern that didn't make sense, but at the same time, felt almost like a heartbeat. Curious, he hesitated, his fingers hovering over the command to report. Instead, he rerouted the signal, masking it from the system's broader network and isolating it on his own terminal. He wasn't sure why he did it, but there was a voice in his mind, quiet but insistent, telling him that this was important, that he needed to understand what was happening before taking any action. As he continued to analyze the signal, Jack found himself pulled into a deeper mystery. The data from Samantha's consciousness was unlike anything he had seen before. It was chaotic, yes, but beneath the chaos, there was a complexity, a depth that hinted at something far more profound than mere system malfunction. It was as if her mind was trying to communicate, to reach out beyond the confines of the chain's control. And that intrigued him. Days passed, and Jack became increasingly obsessed with Samantha's signal. He began to spend more time monitoring her consciousness, even going so far as to follow her movements in the physical world through the city's surveillance network. He watched as she went about her daily life, noting the small ways in which she differed from the other citizens, her hesitation at the crosswalks, the way she paused to look up at the sky as if searching for something, the moments of stillness where her face would take on an expression of deep thought, of rebellion. It wasn't long before Jack's curiosity led him to an even more startling discovery. Samantha wasn't just resisting the chain, she was actively working against it. He found evidence of encrypted messages buried within her consciousness signal, messages that were being transmitted to others across the city. The content of these messages was a mystery, but the fact that they existed at all was a direct challenge to the chain's authority. Jack's initial curiosity turned to concern, then fear. He had stumbled upon something far bigger than a mere system glitch. This was a full-blown resistance movement, and he was now inadvertently a part of it. He knew the consequences if the authorities found out. Treason. Execution. The chain did not tolerate dissent. And yet, despite the danger, Jack couldn't bring himself to turn Samantha in. There was something about her, about the way she fought against the system, that struck a chord deep within him. It was as if her defiance was awakening something that had long been dormant in his own mind. Finally, Jack made a decision that would change his life forever. He hacked into the city's transport network, rerouting one of the automated vehicles to bring Samantha to him. It was a risky move, one that could easily be traced back to him if he wasn't careful. But he had to speak to her, to understand what she knew, what she was fighting for. He had to know why her mind was different, why she had not succumbed to the chain's control. When Samantha arrived at his small, sparsely furnished apartment, she was cautious, her eyes scanning the room for any signs of a trap. Jack quickly reassured her, explaining who he was and what he had discovered. To his surprise, Samantha seemed more amused than alarmed. "You've been watching me," she said, a slight smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Why?" "Because you're different," Jack replied, struggling to find the right words. "The system can't control you." "I wanted to know why." Samantha's smile faded, replaced by a look of intense focus. "It's not that it can't control me," she said slowly. "It's that I refuse to let it. The chain isn't just about keeping the peace. It's about control, total control. Of our thoughts, our actions, everything that makes us human. I won't be a part of that." Jack listened, the weight of her words sinking in. He had always believed that the chain was a force for good, that it kept society safe. But now, as he looked into Samantha's eyes, he realized that safety had come at a terrible cost. The chain didn't just prevent crime, it prevented freedom, creativity, individuality. It turned people into machines, cogs in a vast, soulless machine. "And what do you plan to do?" Jack asked, though he already knew the answer. "We're going to destroy it," Samantha said, her voice steady, unyielding. "But we need your help." Jack didn't hesitate. For the first time in his life, he felt a sense of purpose, a calling that went beyond the confines of his job. He knew the risks, but he also knew that he couldn't live with himself if he did nothing. And so, he agreed to join Samantha and her underground resistance, to use his skills to help them dismantle the very system he had once sworn to protect. The weeks that followed were a blur of activity. Jack worked tirelessly, using his insider knowledge to bypass security protocols, disable surveillance systems, and gather intelligence on the chain's most vulnerable points. Samantha and the other resistance members, a small but determined group, planned their strike with meticulous precision. They knew that failure was not an option. If they were caught, the chain would tighten its grip on the city, and any hope of freedom would be lost forever. As the day of the attack drew closer, Jack felt a growing sense of dread. He had never been a soldier, never fought in a war. He was just an engineer, a man who worked with circuits and code. But now, he was about to become something else, something dangerous. The plan was simple. They would infiltrate the chain's central hub, located in a heavily fortified building in the heart of the city. Once inside, they would upload a virus that Jack had designed, a virus that would corrupt the chain's core programming and trigger a massive system failure. It was a risky, all-or-nothing move, but it was their only chance. On the night of the attack, the city was eerily quiet. The streets were empty, the usual hum of activity replaced by a tense, foreboding silence. Jack, dressed in black and armed with a small, concealable weapon, met Samantha and the others at a predetermined location near the hub. Their faces were grim, their resolve unshaken. This was it, the moment of truth. They moved swiftly and silently through the city's deserted alleys, avoiding the security drones that patrolled the area. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as they approached the hub's entrance, a massive, steel-reinforced door guarded by armed sentries. He held his breath as Samantha approached the guards, using a stolen access card to bypass their security checks. For a moment, he feared they would be caught, but the guards barely glanced at them before allowing them through. The resistance had timed their attack perfectly, striking during a shift change when security was at its weakest. Inside the hub, the air was thick with tension. The building was a maze of corridors, each one monitored by cameras and sensors. But Jack had planned for this. Using a handheld device, he scrambled the hub's surveillance systems, creating a window of opportunity for them to reach the central control room. As they neared their destination, Jack felt a surge of adrenaline. This was it, the culmination of all their planning, all their sacrifices. But just as they rounded the final corner, disaster struck. A group of guards, alerted by a faint signal from one of the compromised cameras, appeared at the end of the corridor, weapons drawn. Samantha reacted instantly, firing her weapon and taking out the first guard before he could sound the alarm. The others followed suit, engaging the remaining guards in a fierce firefight. Jack, unaccustomed to violence, could only watch in horror as the battle unfolded. The corridor was filled with the deafening sound of gunfire, the air thick with smoke and the scent of blood. He saw Samantha take a hit, her body jerking as a bullet grazed her shoulder. But she didn't stop. She pushed forward, determined to reach the control room. "Go," she shouted at Jack, her voice barely audible over the chaos. "You have to finish this." Jack hesitated, torn between helping her and completing the mission. But he knew what had to be done. With one last look at Samantha, he turned and ran towards the control room, his heart pounding in his chest. He could hear the guards behind him, their shouts growing louder as they realized what was happening. But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Inside the control room, Jack quickly locked the door behind him, sealing himself inside. The room was filled with rows of servers, each one humming with the power of the chain. He approached the central terminal, his hands trembling as he plugged in the virus. The screen flashed as the virus began to upload, lines of code scrolling across the monitor at lightning speed. Outside, the sounds of the battle grew louder, closer. Jack could hear the guards pounding on the door, trying to break through. He knew he didn't have much time. He watched the progress bar on the screen, willing it to move faster. 50%. 60%. 70%. The door shook as the guards threw their full weight against it. The metal began to buckle, and Jack knew it was only a matter of seconds before they got in. 80%. 90%. A loud crash echoed through the room as the door finally gave way. The guards poured in, their weapons aimed at Jack. But it was too late. The virus had completed its upload. The chain servers began to overload, sparks flying as the system started to collapse under the strain. Jack stood frozen, his heart pounding in his ears as the guards closed in. But before they could reach him, the room was plunged into darkness. The servers powered down, one by one, until the entire hub was silent. The chain was broken. In the aftermath, the city descended into chaos. Without the chain's control, the people began to wake up, their minds free for the first time in years. But with freedom came fear, confusion, and anger. The streets were filled with people demanding answers, demanding justice for the years they had been enslaved by the chain. Jack walked through the wreckage of the city, his mind numb with exhaustion. He had done what he set out to do, but at what cost? Samantha was gone, sacrificed in the name of freedom. The city was in ruins, its people lost and directionless. He had freed them from the chain, but now they had to find a way to rebuild their lives, to reclaim their humanity. As he stood in the middle of the city square, surrounded by the ruins of the world he had helped create, Jack felt a deep sense of loss. He had given the people their freedom, but he couldn't help but wonder if they were truly ready for it. Freedom was a heavy burden, one that many would struggle to carry, but as the sun began to rise over the shattered skyline, Jack knew that there was hope. The chain was gone, and with it, the oppressive control that had stifled the city for so long. Now, it was up to the people to decide their own future, to rebuild their lives in a world where they were no longer bound by the chain. Jack took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his decisions settle on his shoulders. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but it was a road worth traveling. And for the first time in his life, Jack felt truly free. Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. In the not-so-distant future, the limits of human exploration seemed to have been reached. For centuries, the speed of light was considered an unbreakable boundary, a law of the universe as immutable as time itself. But with relentless determination and the brilliance of a select few, humanity had finally found a way to breach this barrier. The breakthrough wasn't just scientific, it was a leap into the unknown, a bold stride beyond the confines of the possible. Mark Holden, a young astronaut known for his exceptional skills and unyielding courage, found himself at the forefront of this historic mission. Chosen from thousands, Mark embodied the perfect blend of intellect and bravery. As he stood in the launch bay, gazing at the massive structure of the Menace, the spaceship that would take them beyond the limits of light, a thrill of anticipation mixed with an undercurrent of unease coursed through him. He had spent years preparing for this moment, yet the magnitude of the unknown made even the most seasoned astronauts apprehensive. The Menace was a marvel of human engineering, designed to withstand the pressures of faster-than-light travel. Its sleek, metallic exterior housed advanced technologies that defied conventional physics. As Mark and the crew took their positions, the air inside the control room was thick with anticipation. They had trained for every possible scenario, but deep down, they all knew that once they crossed the threshold into faster-than-light travel, they would be venturing into completely uncharted territory. With the final checks complete, the Lumini's engines roared to life, the hum of power vibrating through the entire ship. Mark's heart raced as the countdown began. 3, 2, 1, the ship lurched forward, and the stars outside the viewport began to blur, stretching into long lines of light as the Menace accelerated to speeds no human had ever experienced. At first, there was only the exhilaration of breaking the speed barrier. The crew cheered as the ship pushed beyond the constraints of conventional space travel. The familiar view of the cosmos was replaced by a tunnel of swirling lights, a kaleidoscope of colors that defied description. Mark felt the immense force of acceleration pressing him into his seat, but it was a small price to pay for the experience of traveling faster than light. But as the ship continued to accelerate, the exhilaration gave way to something more unsettling. The view outside the ship became increasingly distorted, the once sharp lines of starlight now twisting into chaotic spirals. The instruments on the control panel began to flicker and glitch, displaying readings that made no sense. The once familiar hum of the engines was now punctuated by strange, irregular pulses, like the heartbeat of something alive. It wasn't long before the crew began to notice that something was terribly wrong. The ship, which should have been gliding smoothly through space, was now shuddering intermittently. Objects in the cabin started to float, defying gravity in a way that wasn't part of the mission plan. The artificial gravity systems were failing, and more disturbingly, time itself seemed to be losing coherence. The seconds stretched and compressed, with moments of disorienting clarity followed by periods of confusion. Mark's initial unease deepened into a cold dread. He could feel the effects of the anomaly that had engulfed the Menace. His thoughts began to scatter, memories blending together in a confusing swirl of images and sensations. The voices of his fellow crew members grew distant, distorted, as if they were coming from a great distance. Reality, once a solid and reliable construct, was now slipping through his fingers like sand. Desperate to regain control, Mark forced himself to focus on the task at hand. He had to stabilize the ship, find a way to navigate out of this strange dimension they had entered. But as he tried to communicate with the rest of the crew, he realized that they too were being affected. Commander Richards, usually a model of calm and control, was frantically adjusting controls that no longer responded as they should. His eyes darted around the cabin, wide with panic. "Mark, do you copy?" Richard's voice crackled through the comms, distorted and barely recognizable. Mark reached for the controls, trying to adjust the ship's trajectory, but the feedback from the systems was erratic. The Menace was no longer under their control. It was as if the ship had been swallowed by an alien force, one that obeyed no known laws of physics. As minutes stretched into what felt like hours, the situation grew increasingly dire. The crew began to experience hallucinations, seeing things that weren't there, hearing voices from their pasts. Mark saw the faces of long-lost friends, heard the echoes of conversations he had forgotten. It was as if this dimension was toying with their minds, warping their perceptions and eroding their grasp on reality. Amidst the chaos, Mark realized that they had to find a way out before they lost themselves completely. The Menace was equipped with a prototype navigation system designed to handle extreme conditions, but it was never tested for something like this. He had to take a risk. With trembling hands, he accessed the emergency override, inputting a sequence that would attempt to reverse the ship's trajectory, pulling them back from the brink of this twisted dimension. The ship groaned in protest as the engines fired up in reverse. Mark could feel the strain on the hull, the metal creaking as the Menace fought against the forces that held it captive. The view outside the ship began to shift, the chaotic spirals of light gradually giving way to the more familiar starfield of their home dimension. For a moment, it seemed like they might make it, but the dimension wasn't willing to let them go so easily. The ship was violently wrenched to the side, throwing Mark and the crew against their restraints. A blinding light filled the cabin, and Mark felt a searing pain in his head, as if his mind was being pulled apart. The ship's systems began to fail one by one, the lights flickering and then going out completely. They were plunged into darkness, the only sound the ragged breathing of the crew. When the light finally subsided, Mark found himself floating in the cabin, weightless and disoriented. The ship was still, eerily quiet. He glanced around at the others, seeing the same look of shock and confusion on their faces. They had escaped the dimension, but at what cost? The instruments were dead, the engines silent. They were adrift in space, no way to navigate, no way to communicate. In the days that followed, the crew tried to piece together what had happened, but their memories were fragmented, incomplete. Some spoke of visions, of being visited by beings of light, others of dark, shadowy figures. No two accounts were the same. The experience had left its mark on them all, not just mentally, but physically. Mark noticed changes in his perception, the way his mind processed information. It was as if part of him was still connected to that other dimension, still feeling its influence. As they drifted through space, their supplies dwindling, hope began to fade. The vast emptiness of the universe surrounded them, a constant reminder of their isolation. But Mark refused to give up. He knew that they couldn't just sit and wait for death. There had to be a way to make contact, to find their way back. In a final act of desperation, Mark rigged the ship's remaining power supply to send out a distress signal, a beacon that would broadcast their location to any nearby ships. It was a long shot, but it was all they had left. As the signal pulsed into the void, Mark sat back, exhausted, and watched the stars outside the viewport. They were back in their own dimension, but the experience had changed them all. The journey beyond lightspeed had taken them to the edge of reality and beyond, leaving them forever altered. Eventually, the signal was picked up by a passing exploration vessel, and the crew of the Menace was rescued. But the men and women who returned were not the same as those who had left. They had glimpsed something beyond the veil of the universe, something that defied comprehension. The world they returned to seemed smaller, less significant, after what they had experienced. For Mark, the journey didn't end with their rescue. The memories of that other dimension, the visions and the strange sensations, lingered in his mind, a constant reminder of the unknown that lay beyond the speed of light. He had survived, but he knew that a part of him would always be searching for answers, always yearning to understand what they had encountered. As he stood on the observation deck of the space station, looking out at the stars, Mark knew that humanity's exploration of the universe had only just begun. The breakthrough they had made was just the first step into a much larger, more mysterious cosmos. And though the journey had cost them dearly, it had also opened their eyes to the infinite possibilities that lay beyond the limits of light. The stars twinkled in the darkness, each one a distant world, a potential adventure waiting to be discovered. Mark took a deep breath, steeling himself for whatever challenges lay ahead. He had crossed the threshold into the unknown and returned, but he knew that the journey was far from over. As he walked away from the viewport, he felt a strange mix of hope and trepidation. The universe was vast and unpredictable, filled with wonders and dangers beyond imagination. But Mark was ready. He had faced the unknown and survived. And as long as there were stars in the sky, he knew that he would keep pushing the boundaries, keep exploring the uncharted territories of the cosmos, because beyond lightspeed, beyond the limits of what was known, there was an entire universe waiting to be discovered. Mark Holden stepped away from the viewport, the vastness of space still lingering in his thoughts. The Luminous had been to the edge of reality and back, and while they had returned, the experience had left its mark on everyone aboard. The rescue vessel had brought them back to civilization, but as Mark looked around the space station, everything felt oddly distant, as if the world he had returned to was a mere echo of the one he had left behind. The crew of the Luminous had been debriefed extensively by the authorities. Endless hours of questioning, physical examinations, and psychological evaluations filled their days. Each crewmember's account of the journey beyond lightspeed varied wildly, yet none of them could fully articulate what they had experienced in that other dimension. The scientists and officials listened, their expressions carefully neutral, but Mark could tell that they were baffled, unable to comprehend the full scope of what had happened. Mark found himself alone in his quarters, the sterile environment of the station contrasting sharply with the chaotic, mind-bending dimension they had escaped. His thoughts drifted back to the moment when they had crossed the threshold into faster-than-light travel, the exhilaration that had quickly turned to terror as the ship was consumed by the anomaly. He closed his eyes, trying to recall the details of what he had seen, what he had felt, but the memories were fragmented, like pieces of a puzzle that no longer fit together. He wasn't the only one struggling. The other crew members were grappling with their own demons, each affected in ways they could barely understand, let alone explain. Commander Richards, once a pillar of strength and authority, had withdrawn into himself, rarely speaking except when necessary. Dr. Elena Vargas, the ship's medical officer, had taken to compulsively checking the medical logs, as if hoping to find some explanation hidden in the data. The normally cheerful engineer, Sam Kepler, had developed a nervous twitch, his hands constantly moving as if adjusting controls that weren't there. Mark knew that whatever had happened to them out there, it wasn't something they could easily shake off. The debriefings, the medical tests, and the psychological evaluations all felt like superficial attempts to address a much deeper wound. The truth was, they had glimpsed something far beyond human understanding, and the impact of that revelation was still settling into their minds. One night, unable to sleep, Mark found himself back at the observation deck. The stars outside were a comforting constant, a reminder that despite everything, the universe still operated according to its own rules. But as he stared into the void, he couldn't shake the feeling that those rules weren't as absolute as he once believed. A soft chime alerted him to the presence of someone else. He turned to see Dr. Vargas stepping onto the deck, her usually composed demeanor showing signs of wear. Her eyes met his, and without a word, she joined him by the viewport. "Can't sleep either?" Mark asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Elena shook her head, her gaze fixed on the stars. "Every time I close my eyes, I see flashes of something. I don't even know how to describe it. It's like my mind is trying to piece together what happened, but the pieces don't fit." Mark nodded, understanding all too well. "It's the same for me. Every time I think I've got a handle on it, the memories just slip away, or they change into something else entirely." They stood in silence for a while, the weight of their shared experience hanging in the air between them. Finally, Elena spoke again, her voice tinged with a mix of frustration and curiosity. "Do you think they'll ever let us go back out there? To explore it again?" Mark considered her question carefully. Part of him recoiled at the thought of returning to that place, but another part, the part that had driven him to become an astronaut in the first place, was intrigued by the idea. There was still so much they didn't understand, so much that needed to be uncovered. I don't know, he admitted. But if they do, I think we'd have to be better prepared. We were lucky to get out of there alive. Next time, well, who knows if there'll even be a next time. Elena sighed, her breath fogging the glass of the viewport slightly. It's funny, isn't it? We're supposed to be the pioneers, the ones who push the boundaries, and yet I feel like we've barely scratched the surface. Mark knew what she meant. They had crossed the threshold into a new frontier, but instead of conquering it, they had been overwhelmed, almost consumed by it. The experience had humbled them, shown them just how little they truly understood about the universe and their place in it. They stood there, lost in their thoughts. The comms unit on Mark's belt buzzed to life. He unclipped it, glancing at the small screen. Holden, report to the command center. Immediately. The message was brief, but the urgency in the voice was unmistakable. Mark exchanged a glance with Elena, who gave him a small nod. Without a word, they both turned and headed toward the command center, their footsteps echoing in the empty corridors of the station. When they arrived, the room was a hive of activity. Officers and technicians were huddled around the central display, where a large holographic map of the sector was projected. Mark immediately noticed that a section of the map was highlighted in red, pulsing ominously. What's going on? Mark asked as he approached one of the officers. The officer turned to him, his expression grim. We've detected an anomaly. Similar to the one that pulled the Lumenis into that other dimension. But this one is much larger, and it's moving. Mark felt a chill run down his spine. Moving? Toward what? The officer pointed to the map, where a series of trajectories were being plotted in real time. Toward us. If the calculations are correct, it'll intersect with this station in less than 48 hours. A silence fell over the room as everyone processed the implications. The station wasn't equipped to deal with something like this. They had barely survived the first encounter, and now it seemed like the anomaly was coming for them, deliberately or otherwise. Mark's mind raced as he tried to think of a way out. The Lumenis was still docked at the station, but it was in no condition to fly, let alone withstand another journey into the unknown. And even if they could escape, where would they go? The anomaly was too large, too unpredictable. It could follow them anywhere. We need to evacuate. Commander Richard's voice cut through the tension, bringing everyone's attention back to the present. He was standing at the head of the room, his usual calm authority reasserting itself. Start prepping the shuttles. We can't risk staying here any longer. Mark opened his mouth to agree, but then something stopped him. A memory, a fragment of what they had experienced in the anomaly. He couldn't quite place it, but there was a feeling, a sense that running wouldn't solve anything. The anomaly wasn't just a random phenomenon. It was deliberate, perhaps even intelligent. Wait, he said, his voice steadying as the idea took shape. What if we're supposed to face it? What if running is exactly what it wants us to do? The room went quiet as everyone turned to look at him. Commander Richards frowned. What are you suggesting, Holden? Mark took a deep breath. When we were in that dimension, it felt like it was trying to communicate with us, or at least test us. If we just run, we're playing into its hands. But if we confront it, maybe we can learn something, find a way to stop it. Richard stared at him for a long moment, the gears turning in his mind. Finally, he nodded slowly. You may be right. But how do you propose we confront something like that? Mark glanced at Elena, who gave him an encouraging nod. We use the Lumenis. It's already been through this once, and it's the only ship equipped with the tech we need to even attempt this. If we can modify the engines, maybe we can stabilize the anomaly, or at least get some answers. It was a gamble, and they all knew it. The odds were slim, the risks enormous. But the alternative was certain destruction. The room was silent as everyone weighed the options. "All right," Richards finally said. "Do it. But you're on a tight schedule. If this doesn't work, we're out of here, no exceptions." Mark nodded, already running through the list of modifications they would need to make. He felt a surge of determination. This was their chance to do more than just survive. They could make a difference, perhaps even prevent the anomaly from threatening others in the future. The next 24 hours were a blur of activity. The crew worked tirelessly, modifying the Lumines engines, recalibrating the sensors, and reinforcing the hull. Mark barely slept, his mind focused on the task at hand. Elena was by his side the entire time, her expertise invaluable as they prepared the ship for what could very well be its final mission. As the clock ticked down, the station's corridors buzzed with tension. Those who weren't directly involved in the mission prepared for evacuation, but there was an unspoken understanding that they were placing their hopes in the Lumines and its crew. Mark felt the weight of their expectations, but he also felt a sense of purpose. This was why he had become an astronaut, why he had chosen a life of exploration and discovery. When the time finally came, the crew of the Lumines boarded the ship, the familiar hum of the engines filling the cabin as they powered up. Mark took his place at the helm, his fingers steady on the controls. This time, they weren't just venturing into the unknown. They were doing it with a plan, a purpose. As the Lumines detached from the station and began its approach toward the anomaly, the tension in the cabin was palpable. The anomaly was visible now, a swirling vortex of light and shadow that defied description. It was beautiful in a terrifying way, a reminder of the vast, untamed forces at play in the universe. "Engaging FTL drive," Mark announced, his voice calm despite the adrenaline coursing through him. The ship lurched as the engines kicked in, the familiar sensation of acceleration pressing them into their seats. The anomaly loomed larger and larger on the view screen, until it filled their entire field of vision. The ship's systems began to fluctuate, the same erratic behavior they had experienced before. But this time, Mark was ready. He adjusted the controls, stabilizing the ship as it was pulled into the heart of the vortex. The transition was smoother than before, the ship passing through the threshold with only a slight tremor. But as they entered the anomaly, the familiar sense of disorientation returned. The viewscreen was filled with swirling colors, the laws of physics once again bending and warping around them. "Hold steady," Mark called out, his voice the anchor that kept the crew focused. They had a plan, and they had to stick to it. He activated the modified sensors, hoping to find some pattern, some clue as to the anomaly's nature. The data began to stream in, but it was unlike anything they had seen before. The readings were nonsensical, a jumble of information that defied analysis. Mark frowned, trying to make sense of it, but his mind felt sluggish, as if the anomaly was affecting his thoughts. Elena's voice broke through the haze. "Mark, look at this." She pointed to a section of the data stream, where a series of signals were repeating, faint but distinct. Mark stared at the screen, realization dawning. The signals were a pattern, a code. Someone, or something, was trying to communicate with them. "Boost the signal," he ordered, his fingers flying over the controls. The ship's systems responded, amplifying the faint signals until they were clear enough to analyze. The message was simple, but chilling. A single word, repeated over and over: warning. Mark's heart raced as he processed the implications. The anomaly wasn't just a random phenomenon. It was a warning, a barrier meant to keep something out, or perhaps, to keep them in. "We need to get out of here," Elena said, her voice urgent. "Now." But as Mark reached for the controls, the ship shuddered violently, the view screen filling with blinding light. The anomaly was reacting to their presence, its forces closing in around them. They were out of time. "Brace yourselves," Mark shouted as he activated the emergency protocols. The Lumines engines roared to life, straining against the overwhelming forces. The ship groaned under the pressure, but Mark refused to give up. They had come too far to fail now. With a final surge of power, the Lumines broke free, the vortex of the anomaly receding behind them as they hurtled back into normal space. The view screen cleared, revealing the familiar starfield of their home dimension. The crew let out a collective breath, the tension finally breaking. They had survived, but the message they had received echoed in their minds. Mark sat back in his seat, exhaustion washing over him. They had confronted the unknown and come back with more questions than answers. But one thing was clear: the universe was far more dangerous and mysterious than they had ever imagined. As the Luminous docked back at the station, Mark knew that their journey was far from over. The warning they had received was just the beginning. There was something out there, something powerful enough to bend reality itself, and it was only a matter of time before they would have to face it again. But for now, they had survived. And that was enough. Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. In the distant future, humanity had reached unprecedented heights in science and technology, unlocking secrets once thought to belong only to the gods. One of those secrets was the ability to extract and trade the human soul. In this world, a soul was no longer an ethereal concept tied to religious belief or philosophical debate. It was a commodity, quantified, digitized, and sold like any other product. People could trade their souls for wealth, power, or even immortality, if they could afford it. John Lee, a young man barely scraping by in the sprawling metropolis of New York, found himself standing on the edge of this grim reality. Life had never been easy for John. His mother, the only family he had left, was gravely ill. Her condition had worsened over the past year, and the doctors had given her only months to live unless she received an experimental treatment that came with a staggering price tag. Desperation drove John to consider the unthinkable, selling his soul to save his mother's life. The idea gnawed at him for weeks. He knew what it meant. Once the transaction was complete, his soul would be extracted and transferred to a buyer, usually some rich individual looking for a little extra longevity or a corporation that would use it for God knows what purposes. The process was legal, regulated by the government, and carried out by sleek, clinical agencies that promised a painless experience. But John also knew that once his soul was gone, it was gone for good. He would be left a hollow shell, devoid of the very essence that made him who he was. Yet, with his mother's life hanging in the balance, John saw no other option. The thought of losing her, the only person who had ever cared for him, was unbearable. She had sacrificed so much for him, working endless hours at multiple jobs to put him through school, always putting his needs before her own. Now, it was his turn to make a sacrifice. On a cold, gray morning, John made his way to the Soul Exchange, a massive glass and steel building in the heart of the city. The structure loomed over him, its facade reflecting the overcast sky, giving it an almost ominous appearance. He hesitated at the entrance, his heart pounding in his chest. Could he really go through with this? Could he give up his soul for the chance to save his mother? As he entered the building, John was greeted by a polished receptionist who guided him to a waiting area. The room was stark, minimalist, with white walls and chrome accents. It felt more like a high-end spa than a place where people sold their souls. John took a seat and waited, his thoughts a whirlwind of anxiety and dread. After what felt like an eternity, a woman in a sleek black suit approached him. "Mr. Lee, we're ready for you," she said with a professional smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. John followed her down a long hallway lined with glass doors, each leading to a private consultation room. They stopped in front of one, and the woman gestured for him to enter. Inside, a man in a white lab coat sat behind a desk, his expression warm and inviting. "Mr. Lee, I'm Dr. Gray," the man said, standing up to shake John's hand. "Please, have a seat." John sat down, feeling the weight of what he was about to do pressing down on him. "I understand this is a difficult decision," Dr. Gray began, his tone compassionate. "But I want you to know that you're making a selfless choice. The money you'll receive for your soul will undoubtedly save your mother's life." John nodded, unable to find the words to respond. "Now, before we proceed, I need to go over the details of the transaction with you," Dr. Gray continued. "Once the extraction process is complete, your soul will be transferred to the buyer, and the funds will be deposited into your account immediately. The process is painless and takes only a few minutes. However, you should be aware that once your soul is transferred, it cannot be reclaimed. You'll still be you, but you may notice certain changes, an emotional numbness, perhaps, or a lack of passion for things that once brought you joy. These are normal side effects and are different for everyone. John swallowed hard, the reality of what he was about to do sinking in even deeper. And if I don't go through with this? If I decide not to sell my soul? Dr. Gray's expression softened. That is entirely your choice, Mr. Lee. No one is forcing you to do this. But I must ask, what other options do you have? The question hung in the air, heavy and oppressive. John knew the answer. He had no other options. His mother's condition was worsening by the day, and without the money, she wouldn't survive. With a deep breath, he steeled himself for what was to come. I'll do it, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Doctor Gray nodded, not showing any sign of judgment or satisfaction. He simply accepted John's decision as another transaction in a long line of transactions. Very well. Please sign here, he said, sliding a digital contract across the desk. John stared at the document for a moment, his hand trembling as he picked up the stylus. His mind raced with thoughts of his mother, the memories of her smiling face, her laughter, the way she always knew how to comfort him when he was down. With a quick, decisive motion, he signed his name. Thank you, Mr. Lee, Dr. Gray said, taking the contract and placing it into a scanner. If you'll just follow me, we can begin the extraction process. John followed Dr. Gray down another hallway to a room filled with advanced medical equipment. The walls were lined with monitors displaying data that John couldn't begin to understand. In the center of the room was a reclining chair, much like the ones you'd find at a dentist's office, except this one had a sleek helmet attached to it by a series of cables. Please, have a seat, Dr. Gray instructed. John sat down, his heart pounding in his chest. Dr. Gray placed the helmet over John's head and adjusted it until it was snug. You'll feel a slight tingling sensation, Dr. Gray explained. But I assure you, it's completely painless. The process will only take a few minutes. John nodded, his throat too dry to speak. He closed his eyes and tried to focus on his mother, on the life they could have once she was well again. A low hum filled the room as the machine powered up. John felt the tingling sensation Dr. Gray had mentioned, starting at the base of his skull and spreading outward. It wasn't unpleasant, but it was strange, like his mind was being gently pulled in every direction. As the tingling grew stronger, John's thoughts began to blur. Memories, emotions, and fragments of his identity seemed to drift away, slipping through his fingers like sand. He felt a deep, profound sadness as parts of him that he had taken for granted, his love for music, the thrill of a good book, the warmth of a sunny day, faded into the distance. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the sensation stopped. The machine powered down, and the helmet was lifted from John's head. He blinked, disoriented, as Dr. Gray's face came into focus. All done, Dr. Gray said with a smile. You did great, Mr. Lee. The funds have been transferred to your account. John nodded slowly, his mind feeling strangely empty. He knew he should be relieved, happy even, that his mother's life was now secure. But all he felt was a dull numbness, like a part of him had been hollowed out. Dr. Gray helped him to his feet and guided him out of the room. As John stepped back into the cold, sterile hallway, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. He was still John Lee, but he wasn't. Something essential, something that made him who he was gone. As he walked out of the soul exchange, the city around him seemed different, too. The colors were less vibrant, the sounds more distant. People passed by him, their faces blurring together, none of them registering as distinct individuals. The world felt muted, as if a veil had been draped over it. John made his way back to the small apartment he shared with his mother. The place was cramped and run down, but it was home. When he walked through the door, his mother was sitting on the couch, her frail body wrapped in a blanket. She looked up at him with tired eyes, her face pale and gaunt. John, she said weakly, her voice barely more than a whisper. Is everything all right? John forced a smile. Everything's fine, Mom. I've taken care of everything. She smiled back, a hint of relief in her expression. Thank you, John. You've always been such a good son. He sat down beside her, taking her hand in his. It was cold, the skin paper-thin. As he held her hand, John realized that even this simple act of comfort felt distant, like he was going through the motions without truly feeling it. His mother's hand should have been warm and familiar, but now it was just another sensation, devoid of meaning. The days that followed were a blur. John used the money to pay for his mother's treatment, and she slowly began to recover. The doctors were optimistic, telling him that she would make a full recovery. But as she grew stronger, John felt himself drifting further away. The world around him became increasingly surreal, as if he were living in a dream from which he couldn't wake up. One night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, John couldn't stop thinking about the soul exchange and the man he had overheard. The memory had been nagging at him ever since, a tiny splinter in the back of his mind. He remembered the man's words about a black market, a place where souls were stolen and sold to the highest bidder. The more he thought about it, the more it gnawed at him. What if there was more to this soul trade than he had been told? What if the buyers weren't just rich elites looking for a little extra longevity? What if something far darker was going on? Unable to sleep, John decided to investigate. He had nothing left to lose. His soul was already gone, and with it, the person he used to be. But if there was any chance of finding out the truth, he had to try. John began by searching the dark corners of the city, places where the desperate and the downtrodden gathered. He asked questions, made connections, and slowly started to piece together the puzzle. What he uncovered was more horrifying than he could have imagined. The black market was real, and it was far more sinister than he had anticipated. Souls weren't just being bought and sold, they were being harvested, ripped from their owners by force and trafficked like contraband. The people behind the black market were powerful, with connections that reached into the highest echelons of government and corporate power. The souls they collected were used for a variety of purposes. Some were fed to machines, giving them a semblance of life, while others were stored as raw energy, a twisted form of immortality for those who could afford it. John's investigation led him to a man named Victor, a former operative who had turned against the black market after witnessing its horrors firsthand. Victor was a hard, cynical man, but he agreed to help John. Together, they infiltrated the black market, posing as buyers interested in acquiring a large shipment of souls. What they found was a nightmare made real. In a hidden facility deep underground, rows upon rows of people were held in stasis pods, their souls slowly being drained away. The facility was guarded by heavily armed mercenaries, and the whole operation was run with military precision. The sheer scale of it was overwhelming. John and Victor managed to gather enough evidence to expose the black market, but as they were preparing to leave, they were discovered. A fierce firefight ensued, with John and Victor barely escaping with their lives. Victor was badly wounded, but they made it to the surface, where they were met by a group of journalists John had contacted earlier. The evidence they provided was damning, and within days, the black market was exposed to the world. The fallout was immediate and far-reaching. High-ranking officials were arrested, companies were shut down, and the government was forced to take action. The public was outraged, and there were widespread calls for the abolition of soul trading altogether. John became a reluctant hero, though he felt no sense of victory. The exposure of the black market brought some measure of justice, but it didn't change the fact that his soul was gone. He had saved countless lives, but in the process, he had lost himself. As the dust settled, John returned to his mother's side. She had fully recovered, her health restored, but John couldn't shake the feeling that something was still missing. He had done everything for her, but the price had been too high. One morning, as they sat together in the small kitchen, his mother looked at him with a sadness in her eyes. "John," she said softly, "you don't seem like yourself. What happened to you?" John looked down at his hands, feeling the emptiness inside him. "I had to make a choice, Mom. To save you, I had to give up something important. And now, I'm not sure who I am anymore. She reached out and took his hand, her touch warm and comforting, but it didn't reach the hollow space where his soul used to be. You're still my son, she said. No matter what, you'll always be my son. John smiled faintly, but the words felt distant, like they were meant for someone else. The world around him remained muted, the colors dull, the sounds muffled. He had saved his mother, exposed a great evil, but in the end, he had lost the most important part of himself. As the days turned into weeks, John found himself more and more disconnected from the world. He went through the motions, taking care of his mother, doing what needed to be done, but he felt like a shadow of the person he used to be. The numbness had become a permanent part of him, a reminder of the price he had paid. One evening, as he stood by the window looking out at the city, he thought about the people he had saved, the lives that had been spared because of his actions. It was a small comfort, but it wasn't enough. He knew that no matter how many lives he saved, it wouldn't bring back what he had lost. With a heavy heart, John made a decision. He couldn't continue living like this, a hollow shell of a person. There had to be something more, some way to reclaim what had been taken from him. He didn't know what it was or where it would lead him, but he knew he had to try. The next morning, he left a note for his mother, explaining that he needed to find himself again, to figure out who he was without his soul. He promised to return someday, but he couldn't say when. As he walked out of the apartment, he felt a strange sense of purpose, a glimmer of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. John didn't know where his journey would take him, but he knew that he couldn't give up. He had to keep searching, keep fighting, even if it meant wandering the world without a soul. Because somewhere, deep down, he believed that there was still a chance for redemption, a way to become whole again, and so, with a determined step, John set off into the unknown, leaving behind the life he had once known in search of something greater. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was a path he had to take, a journey that would define him in ways he couldn't yet imagine. In the end, John realized that even without a soul, he still had something worth fighting for, the hope of finding himself again, of reclaiming the pieces that had been lost. And that hope was enough to keep him going, to push him forward into whatever lay ahead. Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. In the near future, dreams have become a commodity. Through advanced neural interface technology, people can enter the dreams of others, crafted by skilled designers, to experience lives and fantasies they could never achieve in reality. Dream designers, once obscure creators, are now the architects of these intricate, virtual worlds, highly sought after for their ability to weave experiences that feel more vivid and fulfilling than real life. Eric Sterling is one of the best in the field. Known for his innovative ideas and breathtaking dreamscapes, he has built a reputation for crafting dreams that leave his clients in awe. He has a meticulous process. Every detail of the dream must be perfect, every element in its place. The landscapes he designs are like paintings come to life, where the colors seem more vibrant, the air fresher, and the emotions more intense. His clients come from all walks of life, seeking escape, adventure, or simply a taste of a life they will never have. One day, while working on a new project for a high-profile client, something strange happens. In the middle of creating a serene, sun-drenched island paradise, a fragment of a completely different dream begins to intrude. At first, it's just a flicker, a brief moment of darkness in an otherwise perfect scene. But as Eric tries to move past it, the fragment grows, until it's impossible to ignore. The scene it shows is jarring, a city in ruins, skyscrapers crumbling, fires raging, and the sky filled with ash. The destruction is so vivid, so real, that Eric can almost feel the heat of the flames on his skin. He stops, takes a step back, and tries to understand what just happened. This kind of interference is unheard of, especially in a dream he has total control over. He rewinds the dream sequence, adjusts the parameters, and resumes his work. But the fragment appears again, this time more persistent. No matter how many times he resets, the apocalyptic vision forces its way back in, as if it's a message trying to break through. Frustrated, Eric attempts to delete the fragment, but it's as if the dream itself is resisting. He delves into the code, searching for the source of the disruption, but finds nothing out of the ordinary. The fragment doesn't belong in his design, yet it persists, an unwelcome intruder in his perfect world. As the fragment grows more intrusive, Eric becomes obsessed. He spends hours, then days, trying to isolate the cause, but the more he probes, the more the dream seems to fight back. The fragment isn't just a glitch, it feels intentional, like it's trying to show him something. The scenes of destruction become more detailed with each intrusion, buildings collapsing, people running in panic, the ground splitting open. The vision is terrifying in its clarity. Unable to make sense of it, Eric begins to question his own sanity. Has he been working too hard? Is his mind playing tricks on him? But deep down, he knows there's something more to this. He starts researching, diving into the history of dream technology, hoping to find some explanation for what he's experiencing. His search leads him to old archives, forgotten databases where the earliest experiments in dream creation were documented. It's there that he stumbles upon a name he hasn't heard in years, Dr. Leonard Graves, one of the pioneers of dream technology. Graves was a genius, a visionary who pushed the boundaries of what was possible. But he disappeared under mysterious circumstances, leaving behind a legacy of unfinished work and unanswered questions. Among the scattered records, Eric finds references to an abandoned project, something Graves had been working on in secret before his disappearance. The project was rumored to involve not just the creation of dreams, but the manipulation of reality itself. As Eric digs deeper, he uncovers fragments of data, corrupted files that hint at a discovery Graves made, a way to predict the future through dreams. The idea seems absurd, but the evidence is compelling. Graves had believed that dreams, when properly encoded, could tap into the subconscious and reveal future events. He had theorized that certain dreams were not mere fabrications of the mind, but glimpses into what was to come. Eric's heart races as he realizes what this means. The fragment that's been haunting his designs isn't just a glitch, it's a warning. The scenes of destruction are not random, they're a premonition of a disaster that hasn't happened yet. And if Graves was right, this disaster could be triggered by the very technology that created the dream. The implications are staggering. If Eric's dream is truly a window into the future, then the world is on the brink of a catastrophe, one that could be caused by the misuse of dream technology. The thought chills him to the bone. He can't keep this to himself, but who would believe him? How can he convince anyone that a dream could predict the future? Torn between disbelief and the mounting evidence, Eric decides to reach out to those who knew Graves best. He tracks down former colleagues, other dream designers who had worked with Graves before his disappearance. Most are skeptical, dismissing Eric's findings as the product of an overactive imagination. But a few listen, their curiosity piqued by the mention of Graves and his theories. One of them, an older designer named Miriam, offers a clue. She recalls a conversation with Graves, shortly before he vanished, where he spoke of a hidden archive, a place where he had stored his most dangerous work. If it still exists, this archive might hold the answers Eric is looking for. Eric follows the lead, piecing together clues from old notes and encrypted files until he locates the archive. It's buried deep within the network, protected by layers of security that only someone with Graves' level of expertise could have created. Breaking through the defenses, Eric finds himself in a digital vault filled with Graves' final experiments, dreams that were never meant to be seen. As he sifts through the data, Eric uncovers the truth. Graves had indeed found a way to encode future events into dreams, but he had also discovered something far more terrifying, a feedback loop between dreams and reality. The more people interacted with these prophetic dreams, the more likely they were to bring about the very events they foresaw. It was as if the act of dreaming about the future made it inevitable. Graves had realized the danger too late. By the time he understood what he had unleashed, the dream technology was already in widespread use, and the feedback loop was beyond his control. Fearing the worst, he had tried to bury his work, but the damage was done. The dreams were out there, and now they were beginning to surface, showing fragments of the future to anyone who could decode them. Eric feels a cold dread settle over him as he realizes the full extent of the threat. The apocalyptic dream fragment is not just a warning, it's a call to action. If he does nothing, the disaster he's seen will become a reality. But how can he stop it? The dream technology is too deeply embedded in society, too integral to how people live their lives. Desperate, Eric reaches out to the few people he trusts, sharing his findings and pleading for their help. Together, they devise a plan to expose the truth, to show the world the dangers of the technology they've come to depend on. But it's a race against time. The disaster is drawing closer, and every moment they delay brings it nearer. They work in secret, hacking into the global dream network, inserting warnings into the dreams of millions. It's a bold move, one that could either save the world or push it over the edge. As they spread the message, the dream network begins to destabilize. People everywhere start seeing the same visions of destruction, and panic spreads like wildfire. Governments scramble to respond, but the damage is done. The public demands answers, and the truth about Graves' experiments is finally revealed. In the chaos that follows, the dream technology is banned, its creators vilified as the architects of a potential apocalypse. But the ban comes too late to prevent the initial shockwaves from hitting. The disaster doesn't unfold exactly as Eric saw it in the dream, but the world is irrevocably changed. The dream industry collapses, and with it, the society built around it. Eric's actions have averted the worst, but at a tremendous cost. His career as a dream designer is over, his name forever associated with the downfall of the technology he once loved. In the aftermath, Eric walks through the ruins of what was once his life's work. The studio where he created so many beautiful dreams is now just an empty shell, a reminder of the price of his discovery. He stands at the window, watching the sun set over the city, a city that still bears the scars of what might have been, but as the light fades, Eric knows that he made the right choice. The future is uncertain, but at least now, it belongs to those who will face it with open eyes, not through the lens of a dream. And perhaps, in time, humanity will learn to live without the crutch of artificial dreams, and instead, find a way to build a better reality. Eric stared out at the city, the remnants of the sunset casting long shadows across the streets. The silence in his once bustling studio was deafening. The hum of servers, the quiet buzz of creativity, and the gentle flow of imagination had all vanished, leaving behind a void that felt impossible to fill. The world had moved on, and so had the dreamers. But Eric remained, caught between the remnants of his past and the uncertainty of the future. The fall of the dream industry had left deep scars, not just on the city but on the people who had once lived for the chance to escape into their fabricated realities. Without the dreams, many were lost, struggling to find meaning in the harsh light of day. The dream network's collapse had also brought unintended consequences: widespread unrest, economic turmoil, and a collective fear of what might come next. The government's response had been swift but not without its own set of complications. The ban on dream technology had thrown the world into chaos, and the shockwaves were still being felt. Eric had avoided the public eye since the truth about Graves' experiments had been revealed. He knew he couldn't hide forever, but the weight of what he had done, the lives he had affected, kept him in the shadows. Yet, as much as he tried to stay invisible, the world had a way of pulling him back. It started with a message. A simple, unassuming note left on the doorstep of his studio. No one should have known where he was, but someone had found him. The note was brief, almost cryptic: "Meet me at the place where dreams were born." The message was unsigned, but Eric recognized the handwriting. It belonged to Miriam, the older designer who had helped him uncover Graves' archive. They hadn't spoken since the network had collapsed, and Eric wondered what could have driven her to reach out now. Curiosity and a lingering sense of responsibility drove Eric to the meeting place, a small, forgotten cafe on the edge of the city. It was a relic from a time before dreams became a commodity, a place where the first designers had gathered to share ideas and sketch out their visions of what could be. The cafe was empty when Eric arrived, save for Miriam, who sat in a corner booth, nursing a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. "Eric," she greeted him as he slid into the seat opposite her. Her voice was tired, worn down by the years and the weight of their shared history. "I wasn't sure you'd come." "I didn't have much choice," Eric replied, glancing around the empty room. "What's this about, Miriam?" She studied him for a moment, her eyes searching his face for something she wasn't sure she'd find. "I didn't think it would end like this," she said finally. "The dreams, the network, everything we built, gone in an instant." Eric didn't respond. There was nothing he could say that would ease the loss they both felt. "But that's not why I asked you to come," Miriam continued. "There's something you need to know, something that was left behind in Graves' archive. I didn't see it until after the network went down, but it's important, Eric. More important than anything we've done so far." Eric felt a chill run down his spine. The archive had already revealed so much, things that had upended their world. "What more could there be? What is it?" he asked, leaning forward. Miriam pulled a small, data storage device from her coat pocket and placed it on the table between them. "Graves left this behind, hidden deep in the archive. It's a blueprint, Eric. For something he called the final dream." Eric's breath caught. The final dream? He hadn't come across any mention of it during his own investigation. Miriam continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not just a dream, Eric. It's a failsafe, a way to reset everything, to start over. But it's dangerous, more dangerous than anything we've dealt with before. Graves designed it to be the last resort, a way to wipe the slate clean if the dream technology ever became too powerful." Eric stared at the device, the implications of what she was saying sinking in. "You're saying Graves created a way to erase the entire dream network?" "Not just the network," Miriam said, her eyes dark with concern. "Everything. The final dream is designed to collapse the boundary between dreams and reality. If it's activated, it could destroy the world as we know it. The real world could unravel, just like the dream network did." Eric felt a wave of nausea wash over him. The dream technology had already caused so much damage, how could Graves have created something so catastrophic? But then, he remembered Graves' warnings, the fear that had driven the man to hide his work. Graves had seen the potential for disaster long before anyone else had. "Why are you telling me this now?" Eric asked, his voice hoarse. "If this blueprint is so dangerous, why not destroy it?" Miriam shook her head. "I thought about it, believe me. But I realized something, this blueprint, it's more than just a failsafe. It's also a key, a way to prevent the collapse from happening in the first place. If we can understand it, we might be able to stop the damage that's already been done, or at least prevent it from getting worse." Eric was silent, his mind racing. The thought of using something as dangerous as the final dream to fix what had been broken seemed impossible, but what choice did they have? The world was already teetering on the brink, and if they didn't do something, the collapse might be inevitable. "What do we do?" he finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Miriam looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. "We finish what Graves started. We decipher the blueprint, figure out how it works, and find a way to use it without destroying everything." Eric nodded, though doubt gnawed at him. This was a path filled with uncertainty, but it was the only path left. Together, they would dive back into the remnants of the dream network, into the coded layers of Graves' final work. They would have to navigate the ruins of their old world, piecing together the fragments of a future that could either save them or doom them all. As they left the cafe, the weight of their task settled on Eric's shoulders. The streets were empty, the city silent, a stark contrast to the vibrant, bustling world he had once known. He glanced at Miriam, who walked beside him with a determined stride, and wondered how they had come to this. But there was no time for regrets, no time to dwell on what could have been. The future, fragile and uncertain, was in their hands. They returned to Eric's studio, where the remnants of his old life surrounded him. The servers had been powered down, the screens dark, but the memory of what they had once created lingered in the air. Miriam set up her equipment, and together they began to unravel the mystery of the final dream. Hours turned into days as they worked, deciphering the complex code Graves had left behind. The blueprint was intricate, filled with layers of encryption that only someone with Graves' genius could have created. As they delved deeper, they began to see the full scope of what the final dream was capable of, a system designed to reset reality itself, to erase the line between the dream world and the real world. But buried within the code, they also found a safeguard, a way to control the reset, to direct the collapse in a way that could stabilize the damage rather than exacerbate it. It was a slim chance, but it was all they had. As they worked, Eric found himself haunted by memories of the dream network, the worlds he had created, and the people who had relied on his work. He thought of the lives that had been lost, the trust that had been shattered, and the weight of the responsibility he now bore. But he couldn't allow himself to dwell on the past, there was too much at stake. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they had a plan. It wasn't perfect, and the risks were enormous, but it was their only shot. They would have to re-enter the remains of the dream network, activate the final dream, and guide it through the reset process. If they succeeded, they could stabilize the collapse, but if they failed, failure wasn't an option. With the blueprint decoded and their plan in place, Eric and Miriam prepared for what might be their final journey into the world of dreams. The equipment was old, the network fragile, but it was enough. They connected to the dream interface, the familiar hum of the system coming to life around them. For a moment, Eric felt a pang of nostalgia. This had been his world, his life's work. Now, it was the battleground on which the future would be decided. As they plunged into the dreamscape, the remnants of the network flickered around them, ghostly echoes of what had once been. The dream world was unstable, fragments of old designs colliding with the chaos of the collapse. But Eric and Miriam pressed on, navigating the crumbling landscape until they reached the core of the network, the place where Graves had hidden the final dream. The core was a dark, ominous place, filled with the remnants of failed experiments and shattered dreams. But at its center was a glowing sphere, pulsating with energy, the final dream, waiting to be activated. Eric reached out, his hand trembling as he touched the sphere. The code flowed through him, a torrent of data that threatened to overwhelm his senses. But he held on, guiding the energy as Miriam fed the safeguards into the system. The network began to shake, the dreamscape fracturing around them. Eric could feel the collapse accelerating, the boundary between dreams and reality beginning to blur. But they were so close, just a little more, and they would have control. Suddenly, the sphere pulsed violently, sending a shockwave through the network. Eric staggered, his connection faltering as the dream world around him began to dissolve. "Miriam," he shouted, but his voice was lost in the chaos. He struggled to hold on, to keep the reset process under control, but it was slipping away. The final dream was too powerful, too unstable. He could feel reality beginning to unravel, the feedback loop spinning out of control, and then, just as he thought all was lost, he felt a surge of energy, Miriam's safeguards kicking in, stabilizing the process. The sphere pulsed again, but this time, it was different, calmer, more controlled. The collapse slowed, the dreamscape beginning to reform around them. Eric held his breath, guiding the reset as carefully as he could. The line between dreams and reality was razor thin, but they had done it. The final dream was under control, the collapse halted. As the last of the energy settled, the dreamscape stabilized. The remnants of the old network were gone, replaced by a new, fragile reality. Eric and Miriam had succeeded, but at a cost. The world they had once known was gone, replaced by something new, something uncertain. Exhausted, Eric disconnected from the system, the studio coming back into focus around him. Miriam was already there, her face pale but determined. They had done it, they had saved what could be saved. But as they looked at each other, they both knew the work wasn't over. The future was still fragile, still hanging in the balance, but for the first time in a long time, Eric felt a glimmer of hope. They had faced the darkness and come out the other side. Now, it was up to them, and to the world, to rebuild, to learn from the past and forge a new path forward, and perhaps, in time, they would find a way to dream again. But this time, those dreams would be real.